Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Now, my sleepy friends, before we go anywhere together tonight, I want you to do something for me. I want you to take one slow breath in, hold it just for a moment, and then let it go. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go soft and still against the sheets or the armrest or wherever they happen to be resting right now. Because tonight, we are not in a hurry. Tonight, we have nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Tonight, you are safe, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. If you have not already, go ahead and lower the volume just a little. Just enough so my voice feels like it is coming from the corner of the room rather than from inside your skull. Dim your screen if you can. Pull the blanket a little higher. There is a black screen waiting for you if you want it. No bright flashes, no sudden music, no jarring cuts. Just this voice, and the rain, and the quiet. That is all we have here. That is all we need. I want you to know that the stories I tell on this channel are told with deep care. Every person whose name I speak tonight was a real human being. They had families and routines and small, private habits that nobody ever thought to write down. They had a favorite chair, or a particular way of laughing, or something they always said when they walked in through the front door at the end of a long day. They were more than their stories. And so I ask you to hold them gently tonight, the same way you would want someone to hold yours. Nothing here is meant to frighten you. Nothing here is meant to leave you lying awake with your heart hammering and your eyes fixed on the ceiling. These stories will unsettle you. Yes, because they are true, and the truth has a weight to it that fiction never quite manages to carry. But unsettling is different from frightening. Unsettling is what happens when the world shows you something you did not expect, something that makes you think and feel and wonder long after the story ends. And I think that is exactly the kind of company you were looking for tonight. So let us begin. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that no longer quite exists. Not in the way it once did, anyway. I want to take you back more than 100 years, to the edges of a city that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. A city of stockyards and skyscrapers and immigrant neighborhoods stacked 6 families deep. A city of new money and old ambition, where a man could arrive with nothing on a Tuesday morning and retire comfortable by the following decade if the wind happened to blow in the right direction. A city that smelled of the lake in the early mornings and of coal smoke in the evenings, where the electric streetcars rattled up and down the boulevards and the newspapers were red cover to cover every single day because the news never seemed to run out. I want to take you to Chicago. Not the Chicago you might know today, with its gleaming glass towers and its tourist river walks and its late-night restaurants where the lighting is always perfect. I want to take you to Chicago in 1907, to a city that was still raw at the edges, still hungry, still surprising everyone who thought they understood it. And somewhere in that city, on an autumn evening when the air had just begun to carry the first suggestion of frost, a woman sat at a small table in a cafe and rested her hands in her lap and tried very hard to look like she had nowhere particular to be. She was well dressed. Her posture was good. She had the particular kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from practice, from years of learning how to occupy a room without drawing the wrong kind of attention. On the table in front of her was a pocketbook, an alligator skin pocketbook, beautifully made, with a brass clasp that caught the light when she moved. It was a lovely thing, the kind of accessory that whispered rather than shouted. The kind of object that a certain type of woman carries when she wants the room to know something about her without being obvious about the wanting. A man at a nearby table noticed the pocketbook. He noticed it not because it was beautiful, though it was, and not because it was expensive, though it clearly was that too. He noticed it because 3 days earlier he had read a description of exactly that pocketbook in a report that had crossed his desk. He was a detective. His name was Lieutenant James Larkin, and he had been looking for that pocketbook and the woman who took it for 72 of the longest hours of his professional life. He did not stand up immediately. He did not raise his voice or reach for his badge. He simply watched. He finished his coffee. He let the woman at the small table believe that she was invisible, which she was very, very good at believing. And then, When the moment was exactly right, he moved. But here is what Lieutenant Larkin did not know yet, and what I want you to sit with for a long moment before we go any further. The woman with the pocketbook was not who he thought she was. Not entirely. She was the wife of a Milwaukee millionaire. She had grown up in a small town in northern Wisconsin. She had once been a schoolteacher. She had once been completely, utterly, gloriously ordinary. And somewhere between that ordinary beginning and this particular cafe, on this particular autumn evening, something had happened to her. Something quiet and private and irreversible, that had turned her into a woman that the newspapers would eventually call the most dangerous female thief in Chicago's history. Her name was Evelyn Romadka, and this is her story. Let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back far enough that none of this has happened yet. Far enough that Evelyn Kane is still just a young woman in a small town, and the world still seems entirely, reliably ordinary. Picture northern Wisconsin in the early years of the 20th century. Not the Wisconsin of today with its highways and its outlet malls and its endless, cheerful signs for cheese curds and supper clubs. Picture it as it was then. Quieter, slower, more contained. The winters long and serious. The summers brief and brilliant. The town small enough that everybody knew the names of everybody else's dogs, and the school was the center of everything. And a new face was an event worth discussing for weeks. Evelyn Kane grew up in a world like that. The details of her very early childhood are the kind that history has a habit of losing. The names of her parents, the size of her family, the precise neighborhood where she learned to walk and talk and form opinions about things. What we know is that she was there, in that quiet northern landscape, growing up alongside the pine trees and the cold lakes, and the particular rhythm of a life that did not ask very much of anyone and did not offer very much in return. She became a schoolteacher. This is the part that matters most about her early life, I think, because it tells you something important about who she was before everything else. A schoolteacher in a small Wisconsin town at the turn of the century was not simply a woman who taught children their letters. She was, in a very real sense, the intellectual heart of the community. She was educated. She was respected. She was observed and discussed and quietly admired by the people around her. And she was, almost certainly, a little restless. Not noticeably restless. Not the kind of restless that makes people talk. Just the quiet, private kind. The kind that lives behind the eyes and comes out in small moments when you are staring out the window at a gray November afternoon and you find yourself thinking about somewhere else, somewhere warmer, somewhere where things happen differently, somewhere where you might happen differently too. She was beautiful. This is mentioned in almost every account of her life, and while I always feel a little careful about leading with that particular fact, because it has a tendency to reduce a woman to a single quality and follow her everywhere she goes, in Evelyn's case it mattered in a very specific and practical way. It mattered because it was the reason a certain man noticed her, and without that noticing, none of the rest of this story would have unfolded the way it did. His name was Charles Romadka. He was the son of a wealthy Milwaukee manufacturing family, the Romadka Brothers Trunk Company, which was exactly what it sounded like. A company that made trunks, the heavy, leather and brass kind that wealthy people used when they traveled, the kind that got stacked in the bellies of steamships and loaded onto the roofs of horse-drawn carriages and carried up the stairs of fine hotels by young men in uniforms. The trunk business was a good business in 1907. People were going places. People had things to carry. Charles was visiting northern Wisconsin on a hunting trip when he met Evelyn. The exact circumstances of their meeting, which party, which dinner, which mutual friend performed the introduction, are lost to history in the way that pleasant, ordinary moments often are. What we know is that he met her, and that he was charmed, and that the charm did not wear off the way it sometimes does when the novelty of a new face fades and you are left with just a person again, ordinary and real. He came back. He wrote letters. He was persistent in the quiet, confident way of a man who has rarely been told no and sees no particular reason why this time should be different. And Evelyn, who had been standing in front of children all day explaining arithmetic and the proper use of the semicolon and trying not to think too hard about the narrowness of the horizon visible from the schoolroom window, Evelyn said yes. Not immediately, perhaps. Not without consideration. But she said yes. His family disapproved. This matters, and I want you to hold it. Because disapproval of this particular kind, the The kind that comes from money looking down at a lack of money. Leaves marks. It leaves marks on the person who is disapproved of, obviously, the quiet injuries of being found insufficient, being judged on the basis of what you do not have rather than what you are. But it also leaves marks on the relationship itself. A hairline fracture that is invisible under normal conditions, but that opens under enough pressure. Charles loved Evelyn enough to marry her despite his family's feelings. The question that history does not answer, and that I find myself turning over quietly, is whether Evelyn ever fully forgot that his family had not wanted her there. They married anyway, and Evelyn became Evelyn Romadka. And with that name change came an entire new life. A house in Milwaukee, a position in society, clothes and furniture, and social engagements of a kind she had not previously had access to. The quiet schoolroom in the pine-shadowed north gave way to parlors and dinner parties and the soft, insistent hum of a world that ran entirely on wealth. For a time, and accounts suggest it was a genuinely happy time, or at least a time that wore happiness convincingly. She was content. She had a daughter. A small, specific, miraculous human being who was entirely hers, and who gave the world a new kind of weight and meaning. A child changes the way you understand permanence. It makes you want things to last. But then she became ill. Seriously, dangerously ill. The kind of illness that in 1907 could not simply be managed with antibiotics and follow-up appointments, but required instead a major surgical operation, the kind where the outcome was genuinely uncertain and the recovery was long and hard, and changed something fundamental about the landscape of the body and, perhaps, about the landscape of the mind. She survived. She recovered. She came back to the house in Milwaukee, to the daughter and the parlor and the husband who had waited anxiously by her bedside. She came back, but she came back different. And this is where I want you to slow down with me. Because she came back different is the kind of thing that people say, and it sounds almost too simple to be meaningful. But the people who knew her in those months after the operation kept saying it, over and over, in the same slightly bewildered tone you use when you're trying to describe something you can see clearly but cannot quite name. Her moods shifted in ways they could not predict. She was secretive in a way she had not been before. She seemed, at times, to be living somewhere else entirely. Present in the room but absent in the way that matters. Her eyes carrying a weight that had not been there before the illness, before the surgeon's hands had done whatever it is they did inside her. Nobody knew what to do with this. Charles did not know what to do with it. Her friends did not know what to do with it. The doctors, when consulted, spoke carefully about the strains of recovery, the adjustment period, the need for patience and rest, and the gentle, steady passage of time. Time passed, gently, and then less gently. And then one day, Evelyn Romadka was simply gone. No note. No explanation. No goodbye. She walked out of the house in Milwaukee and did not come back, and her husband, standing in the hallway with the particular, vertiginous confusion of a man whose world has just shifted under him, had no idea where she had gone, or why, or whether she intended to return. He searched. He inquired. He waited. He did all the things you do when someone disappears from your life without warning, and none of them worked, because the woman he was looking for was not, in any meaningful sense, where he was looking. She was in Chicago, living under a different name, working as a maid. And the story she was writing for herself in that city, the story that would eventually lead to a cafe, and an alligator skin pocketbook, and a detective named Larkin who had been watching her for 72 hours. That story was only just beginning. We are going to follow her there. We are going to walk with her through the streets of Chicago in 1907 and try to understand, as best we can, what it was that she wanted and why she chose to want it in the way she did. We are going to meet the people she met and see the rooms she entered and understand, slowly and carefully, how a schoolteacher from northern Wisconsin became the woman the newspapers would eventually call the queen of the vampire women. But not yet. Let us rest here for just a moment longer, in the space between what she was and what she became. Let us sit with the image of a woman standing at a doorway, the doorway of a house in Milwaukee, perhaps, or the doorway of a train station, or the doorway of whatever choice it was that set all of this in motion. And let us not rush past it. Because whatever came after, this moment matters. This is the moment before. And the moment before is always worth understanding. Even when, perhaps especially when, what comes after is impossible to defend. Breathe in. Let it go. We have only just begun. The city that Evelyn arrived in was not a gentle place. Let me try to give you a sense of it, because the setting matters enormously in this story. The way the setting always matters when we are trying to understand why a person does something that seems, from a comfortable distance, entirely incomprehensible. Chicago in 1907 was a city of about 2 million people. It was loud and fast and perpetually under construction, the kind of city where an empty lot could become a 12-story building before you had fully made up your mind about what you thought of the lot. The elevated trains rattled overhead and rained sparks down onto the streets below. The stockyards operated 24 hours a day in the southwestern neighborhoods, and on certain days when the wind came from that direction, you could smell them all the way downtown. The river ran green and slow through the center of the city, carrying the debris of industry, and the lake spread out cold and enormous to the east. And between those two bodies of water, the city existed in a state of permanent, slightly breathless becoming. If you had money in Chicago in 1907, you lived in a particular kind of world. You lived in a tall brownstone house in one of the elegant residential neighborhoods north of the Loop. You employed servants, a cook, a housekeeper, perhaps a laundress who came 3 days a week, perhaps a coachman, or, if you were very modern about it, a man who could manage the new automobile that sat in the carriage house looking important and mechanical and slightly threatening. You ate elaborate dinners and attended the opera and visited one another for afternoon teas that stretched long into the evening. You subscribed to the Tribune and the Inter-Ocean and perhaps one or two of the smaller society papers that tracked the movements of people like you with a devotion that was almost religious in its intensity. And if you needed a new maid, if your previous housemaid had left to marry a factory worker or returned to her family in Poland, or simply disappeared in the way that domestic servants sometimes did, without explanation or apology, you placed an advertisement in the newspaper and you waited. You did not, in those days, do background checks. You did not call a registry or verify references with any particular rigor. You read the ad responses that arrived in the mail, or you met the women who knocked at your back door, and you made your judgment based on appearance and manner and the quality of the references provided. And if those things seemed satisfactory, you brought a stranger into the most intimate spaces of your home and trusted them with your silver and your jewel cases and the particular topography of your daily life. Evelyn Romadka understood this system completely, and she understood it not because she was evil, or at least not simply because she was evil. I want us to hold more complexity than that tonight, but because she had spent time in houses like these. She had been the woman of the house. She had watched how the domestic economy operated from the inside, from the position of the person who employed rather than the person who was employed. She knew what employers looked for. She knew how to present herself. She knew how to be exactly what someone needed her to be. She answered advertisements. This is the part that still strikes me, all these years later, as simultaneously audacious and methodical. She was a millionaire's wife, or had been, or technically still was. And yet she sat down with the newspaper and scanned the classified section under domestic help wanted and composed careful, plausible letters of application and signed them with a name that was not her own. She described qualifications and experience and the kind of trustworthy, quiet diligence that wealthy housewives prized in their household staff. She provided references. Whether those references were real people who would back her story, or invented names at invented addresses, or genuine women who had known her in some other context and could speak to her character without knowing what she intended to do with it. That detail is lost now, and perhaps it is just as well. What we know is that it worked. Multiple times. At multiple addresses in the elegant residential neighborhoods north of the Loop. She would arrive at a new position looking exactly right. Neat, calm, respectful without being obsequious. She would learn the house quickly, which rooms the family used most, where things were kept, when the household was most occupied, and when it was most empty. She was good at making herself useful without making herself noticed. Good at being present without being seen. This is, in a strange and unsettling way, a kind of genius. The ability to move through spaces that belong to other people as though you belong there yourself. As though you have always been there. As though you are as much a part of the furniture as the mahogany sideboard and the aspidistra by the window. And then, when she had learned everything she needed to know, she would take what she had come for, and she would leave. No confrontation. No violence. No drama. Just a space where a woman had been, and then no woman. And then later, sometimes hours later, sometimes days, the quiet discovery that certain things were missing. A pearl necklace from the velvet-lined drawer. A diamond brooch from the top of the dressing table. A collection of small, precious things from the leather jewel case in the wardrobe. Gone with the same quiet efficiency with which they had been identified and studied and waited for. The police, when called, would write up their reports with the particular weary thoroughness of people who understand that the odds of recovery are poor. Servants stole. This was understood. This was, in the world of wealthy Chicago households in 1907, a fact of life, regrettable but not particularly surprising. The servant would be dismissed, obviously, except that in most of these cases the servant had already dismissed herself, and a new advertisement would be placed in the newspaper, and life would continue, and the missing pearls and brooches and diamond pins would be quietly mourned in the way that lost things are mourned, and gradually, over time, forgotten. Nobody, in the early days of this particular series of thefts, connected the disappearing maids. Nobody, in the early days, thought to ask whether there might be a pattern. The thefts happened in different neighborhoods, to different families, at different times. The woman who had done them was good at being different things in different places, different names, different histories, different carefully constructed versions of herself. But the jewels all went to the same place. His name was William Jones, though he was also sometimes called Albert Jones, and the question of which name was real and which was borrowed tells you something important about who he was and what kind of world he moved through. He was connected to the criminal underground of Chicago, not the glamorous cinematic kind, not the kind that would eventually become the stuff of movies and mythology, but the quieter, grimier, more practical kind. The kind that deals in things that need to move quickly from the hands that stole them to the hands that will buy them, and ask no questions, and carry them away to wherever stolen beautiful things go. He was a fence. That is the word for it. A man who took stolen goods and converted them into money and kept a portion of the conversion for himself. And Evelyn brought him everything she took. Every pearl necklace, every diamond brooch, every golden pin and silver bracelet and precious stone that she lifted from the quiet houses of wealthy Chicago families. All of it went to him. And here is the part that investigators would find most baffling, and that I find most human, and that I think you will find most human too if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. She was not doing this for the money. Not primarily. Not in the way that a person who needs money does things that get money. She was doing it for him. She had fallen in love with William Jones. Deeply, completely, in the way that is hard to explain to someone who has never felt it and impossible to explain to someone who has. A kind of love that reorders everything. That makes actions that would otherwise be unthinkable feel not only possible, but necessary. She stole for him the way people in an earlier century might have written poems or commissioned portraits or made pilgrimages to distant shrines. It was an offering. It was a declaration. It was, in whatever private vocabulary she had built for herself to explain her choices to herself, the thing she did to prove that she was real and present and entirely, desperately his. He sold the jewels, and they lived on the money together. They occupied some corner of Chicago that we cannot fully reconstruct from the records, some rented room or furnished apartment in a neighborhood where people did not ask too many questions about the people they lived next to. They were, in whatever sense was available to them, a household, a life. Meanwhile, in Milwaukee, Charles Romadka was trying to understand what had happened to his wife and failing. And in the elegant houses north of the Loop, women were opening jewel cases and finding them empty and calling their household staff together with expressions that mixed anger and confusion and the particular humiliation of having been fooled by someone they had trusted. And in police precincts across the city, reports were being filed that said, in the careful language of official documents, that a servant had absconded with valuables, and that the servant was described as neat and well-spoken and in possession of a reference letter that probably should have been examined more closely. Nobody was connecting the dots yet. Nobody had drawn a line through all the empty jewel cases and all the vanished servants and arrived at one woman. One woman with a talent for being invisible. One woman who had walked out of a life in Milwaukee and into a life in Chicago, and who had, somewhere in that transition, made a series of choices that she would spend the rest of her known life paying for. The summer of 1907 moved through Chicago in the way that Midwestern summers do, slowly and then all at once. Oppressive heat giving way to thunderstorms that left the streets steaming and the air briefly, beautifully clear. The city went about its business. The newspapers were full of politics and scandals and the particular social news that Chicago society consumed with such appetite. The wealthy families in the residential neighborhoods north of the Loop returned from their summer retreats and reopened their houses and placed their inevitable advertisements for domestic help. And Evelyn answered them. By the time September arrived, the total value of the jewelry she had stolen was approaching $25,000 in 1907 dollars. To give you a sense of what that means in terms that feel real, $25,000 in 1907 was more than most working-class families in Chicago would earn in an entire decade. It was a significant house, or a small factory, or the kind of financial security that most people in that city spent their entire lives working toward without ever quite reaching it. She had taken all of it in small pieces, one jewel case at a time, from houses where such things were abundant enough that they could be missed without being catastrophic. But the September that was about to arrive was going to be different from the summers and springs that had come before. Something was going to change. One particular theft, in one particular house, on one particular day when the family had gone out and left a door unlocked, was going to set in motion the sequence of events that would end in a Chicago cafe and an alligator skin pocketbook and a detective named Larkin who noticed the things that other people missed. And that particular theft had a particular beginning, one that I want to walk you through carefully because I think the details matter. I think the details always matter. The Beck House, Labor Day, 1907. A family gone for the afternoon. A door left unlocked because someone was in a hurry, or careless, or simply believed, the way we all believe, most of the time, without quite realizing we believe it, that today would not be the day anything went wrong. But first, let me tell you something about the moment just before that. Because there is always a moment just before. There is always a person standing somewhere, making the last ordinary choice they will make before the chain of events begins to move, and they do not know yet that this is what it is. They think it is just a Tuesday. They think it is just an afternoon. They think the door they just forgot to lock is simply a door. It never is. Let us stand outside the Beck house for a moment before we go inside. Let us look at it the way Evelyn must have looked at it on that Labor Day afternoon in September of 1907. It would have been a solid, respectable house. The kind of house that announces financial comfort without announcing extravagance. A brownstone in one of the good neighborhoods, with a wrought iron fence along the front and a small, well-kept garden that nobody in the family tended personally because that was what the gardener was for. The curtains in the front windows were heavy and good quality, pulled partly closed against the afternoon light in the way that curtains are pulled when a family has gone out and wants the street to know that nobody is home, which is, when you think about it, a rather interesting piece of information to advertise. The neighborhood was quiet in the particular way of prosperous neighborhoods on holiday afternoons. The houses sat back from the street behind their fences and their gardens, sedate and a little self-satisfied, exhaling the faint smell of cut grass and warm stone. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking without much conviction. The streetcar had passed 10 minutes ago and would not pass again for another 20. Evelyn had been watching the house. Not in an obvious way, never in an obvious way, but with the patient, sideways attention of someone who has learned to gather information without appearing to be gathering information. She had been in the neighborhood before. She may have even been inside this particular house before, in a different capacity, at a different moment, during the careful preparatory work that preceded every theft. Or perhaps she simply recognized the shape of it from 100 houses like it, from the accumulated knowledge of a year spent moving through these spaces and learning their patterns and their vulnerabilities. She tried the front door. It was unlocked. Let us sit with that for a moment. Not because it is dramatic, though it is, in a quiet way, but because it is so thoroughly, heartbreakingly human. A family leaving in a hurry. Someone saying I'll get it on the way out, and then not getting it. A door that swings open when it should not swing open, and behind it a house that is entirely empty and entirely full of things. She went inside. The house was still and dim in the afternoon light. The particular silence of an empty house has a texture to it. You notice it in the way that you notice silence after noise, as a presence rather than an absence. Every creak of the floorboards, Every tick of the clock on the mantelpiece is louder and more deliberate when there is no human movement to absorb it. But Evelyn was practiced at moving through empty houses. She had learned, through repetition and necessity, to be part of the silence rather than a disruption of it. She moved through the rooms with the systematic attention of someone who knows exactly what she is looking for and exactly where. In houses like this, such things are kept. The master bedroom was the obvious first destination, the room where the jewelry would be, in the dressing table drawer or the wardrobe or the small velvet-lined case that sat on the top of the chest of drawers like a small, quiet declaration of wealth. And that is where she found it. Not the jewelry case she might have expected, but something else. Something better, in a purely practical sense, and something more poetic in the particular narrative logic of this story. An alligator skin pocketbook, beautifully made, sitting exactly where someone had left it in a moment of inattention or trust or simple human forgetting. She opened it. Inside, jewels. The kind of small, personal collection that a woman accumulates over years of living the life that this particular house was built to contain. A ring or two, some brooches, a string of pearls, the kind of things that are not necessarily kept in the main jewel case, because they are worn often enough that they live in the pocketbook, close at hand, ready. She took it. The whole pocketbook, not just the contents, which was, in retrospect, a mistake, though she probably did not think of it that way at the time. The pocketbook was distinctive in a way that individual pieces of jewelry, removed from their settings, melted down and sold separately, would not have been. A pocketbook is a single, identifiable object. A pocketbook has a description. A pocketbook is exactly the kind of thing that a detective notices when he sits down at a table in a Chicago cafe and looks across the room and recognizes, with the specific certainty of someone who has spent 3 days staring at a description, the thing he has been looking for. But that is 3 days from now. On this particular afternoon, Evelyn left the Beck house with the alligator skin pocketbook and walked back out into the quiet holiday afternoon and vanished into the city the way she always did, efficiently, without drama, without leaving anything behind that would tell the police very much about who she was or where she had gone. The Becks came home to an unlocked door and a missing pocketbook. They reported the theft. Lieutenant James Larkin received the report. He read the description of the pocketbook. He filed it somewhere in that extraordinary mental filing system that good detectives develop over years of doing the work, the system that cross-references and compares and occasionally, in moments of what feels like intuition but is really just the sum of accumulated experience, makes a connection that other people miss. And then 3 days later he walked into a cafe, and there it was. He did not move immediately. I want to make sure you understand that about him, because I think it tells you something important about the kind of detective he was. A lesser man, a more impulsive man, or a man more interested in the drama of the arrest than in the certainty of the case, would have moved immediately, would have crossed the room and made himself known and turned the whole cafe into a scene. But Larkin sat with his coffee and he watched. And while he watched, he was thinking about what he was seeing and what it meant and what questions it raised. The woman was well dressed. Not the dress of a servant, or of a woman living hand to mouth in a rented room somewhere in the less desirable parts of the city. This was the dress of a woman of means, of education, of social position, or at least of someone who understood very well how to present as all of those things. Her posture was composed. Her hands were still. She gave the impression, to anyone not looking for anything in particular, of being exactly what she appeared to be, a respectable woman, resting between errands, having a quiet moment to herself in a busy city on an autumn afternoon. But she was carrying a stolen pocketbook. And Lieutenant Larkin had been in this business long enough to know that a stolen pocketbook was not a coincidence, and was not an error, and was not simply the result of an accidental mixing up of similar accessories. A stolen pocketbook was a choice. And a choice, when you started following it backward, led somewhere. He followed her when she left the cafe. He was discreet about it, and careful, and he kept enough distance that she would not feel the particular prickling at the back of the neck that people feel when they are being watched by someone who knows what they are looking for. He followed her through the streets of Chicago, which were filling up with the early evening traffic of people returning home from wherever they had spent the day, and he followed her to an address, and he made note of the address. And then he went back to the precinct and began the work of finding out who she was. What he found, over the next several days, was not what he expected. The address led him to a name that led him to another name that led him, eventually, and with some difficulty, because she had been careful and deliberate about the layers of identity she had constructed, to a woman named Evelyn Romadka, wife of Charles Romadka, son of the Romadka brothers' trunk company of Milwaukee, a millionaire's wife. Larkin sat with this information for a moment that I imagine was one of the stranger professional moments of his career. He was a practical man, a detective in a city where crime was abundant and varied and rarely surprised him very much anymore. He had arrested thieves of every description, pickpockets and confidence men and burglars of every degree of skill and audacity. He had arrested women before, though it was less common, and the cases always attracted more attention than he thought was strictly necessary. But a millionaire's wife, a woman who had walked out of a life of luxury and reinvented herself as a serial thief with an estimated haul of $25,000. This was something he had not seen before. He prepared the arrest with care. October 16, 1907. The date is preserved in the newspaper records of the time with the precision that newspapers apply to the dates of things that they know will interest their readers. It was a Wednesday. The weather, as it often is in Chicago in mid-October, had turned serious. That particular Lake Michigan seriousness that descends on the city in autumn and does not lift until spring, a gray and windswept seriousness that makes you feel that the summer was a long time ago and the summer to come is a very long time away. When Larkin and his officers arrived at the address where Evelyn was staying, she did not run. This is interesting, and I want you to hold it as interesting rather than simply predictable, because it tells you something about her state of mind at that moment. She had been running, in a metaphorical sense, for more than a year. She had been maintaining the elaborate, exhausting architecture of a double life. The false names, the carefully constructed domestic servant persona, the constant vigilance that comes from inhabiting a space you are not supposed to inhabit. She had been good at it. Extraordinarily good. And she had been caught. When the officers knocked and identified themselves, and she understood what was happening, something in her settled. Something that had been held in tension for a long time. The particular tension of a person who is always waiting for the thing that they know, on some level, is coming. That tension released. She did not scream. She did not make a scene. She was, by all accounts, exactly as composed as she had been in the cafe. Exactly as still. Exactly as present while also being, in some fundamental way, somewhere else. She was taken to the station and questioned. At first she denied everything. She told the investigators that the jewelry in her possession, the jewelry in the alligator skin pocketbook and elsewhere, the jewelry that they found when they searched her rooms, had been given to her by her husband. It was a reasonable opening gambit, the kind that might buy time or at least complicate the investigation, and she delivered it with the calm conviction of someone who has rehearsed it. Charles Romadka, who was contacted by telegraph and who made the journey to Chicago as soon as he received the news, told them that this was not true. That, I imagine, was a complicated conversation between the detective and the estranged husband, between the husband and the wife who had vanished from his life without explanation and reappeared in a Chicago police precinct under investigation for multiple counts of burglary, between the man who had loved this woman and married her against his family's wishes and waited anxiously by her bedside when she was ill and searched for her when she disappeared, between that man and the woman who had become someone he did not recognize. But we will come back to Charles. We will come back to what this did to him and what it meant and how people who loved someone they never quite understood carry that afterward. For now, let us stay with Evelyn, in the precinct, in the moment when the first story she told stopped working. She held on to the denial for as long as she could, but the evidence was not cooperating with the denial. Larkin had been thorough. The descriptions from multiple households, from the families who had employed a servant who had vanished along with their valuables, from the servants who had worked alongside her and could describe her, from the neighbors who had seen her coming and going. All of it was accumulating into something dense and irrefutable. And the alligator skin pocketbook was sitting on the detective's desk, and it was exactly what it was. Eventually, she told the truth, or a version of the truth. A truth shaped by the particular logic of a woman who has made a series of choices that she is not prepared to entirely repudiate, because repudiating them entirely would mean repudiating the thing at the center of them. and the thing at the center of them was the only thing in the recent landscape of her life that had felt, to her, like it mattered. She had stolen the jewels. She admitted that. Multiple houses, multiple thefts, over the course of more than a year. She had posed as a domestic servant to gain access to the homes. She had taken the jewelry and brought it to the man she loved. She had done this for him, and she would do it again, and she was not going to pretend that it had been some kind of aberration or madness or the result of forces beyond her control, because that would have been a lie of a different kind. The man she loved was William Jones, and the detectives, who had been listening carefully to everything she said and noting down the things that she had perhaps not meant to be so specific about, were already making plans to find him. The discovery of William Jones happened the way many such discoveries happen in detective work, not through a single brilliant stroke of insight, but through the patient accumulation of small details that eventually add up to an address. Evelyn, in her confession, had not set out to betray him. But love and confession are difficult to keep in separate rooms, and investigators who are skilled at their work know how to listen for the things that are not quite being said alongside the things that are. There were telephone numbers. This is a detail I find oddly touching, in a complicated way. The intimacy of telephone numbers in 1907, when telephones were still new enough to carry a faint air of the miraculous, when the act of speaking to someone across the city felt like a kind of small magic. Evelyn and William had maintained their connection partly through telephone calls. And telephone calls, in 1907, could be traced if you knew who to ask and were persistent enough about the asking. The detectives traced the numbers. They found an address on the south side of the city, in a neighborhood that was not the kind of neighborhood where questions got asked and answers expected. They prepared their approach carefully, because a man connected to Chicago's criminal underground was not the same as a woman in a cafe with a stolen pocketbook, and the element of surprise had value that they did not want to waste. But here is where the story takes one of those turns that make you wonder about fate, or luck, or the particular cruelty of timing. Somebody warned him. Someone, and we do not know who, whether it was someone on the margins of the investigation who talked when they should not have, or someone who saw the officers preparing their visit and recognized what it meant, or simply a network of whispers that moved through certain parts of Chicago faster than official police communications could move. Someone sent William Jones a message, a warning that the police were coming. He received it in time to make preparations. He did not leave. This is the choice that strikes me most strangely about William Jones, the choice that I find myself returning to in the long, quiet moment between one part of a story and the next. He received a warning that the police were coming, and he did not run. He stayed. He prepared. What he prepared was a telephone call of his own, to Evelyn, in the precinct, where she was still being held and questioned. He wanted, presumably, to coordinate their stories, to make sure that what she was saying and what he was going to say, when the time came, were compatible enough to create at least some reasonable doubt. He may have wanted to reassure her, or she him, or both. The exact content of what he intended to say we will never know, because the detectives had anticipated exactly this move, and they had arranged for the call to be intercepted. When the telephone rang and the call connected, it was not Evelyn's voice that greeted him. The detectives moved on his address within the hour. And inside the house, inside a trunk, which has a poetic resonance in this story, given that the Romadka family fortune was made in trunks, they found the accumulated evidence of everything that had been stolen. Jewels from multiple thefts. Pieces that could be matched to descriptions in police reports going back more than a year. The private, sparkling record of an obsession, locked away in a piece of luggage. William Jones was arrested. He was, by all accounts, less composed about this than Evelyn had been. Less resigned. He had more to lose, perhaps, in a practical sense. A man operating in the criminal economy of Chicago had more exposure, more entanglement, more threads that could unravel if the right people started pulling. But whatever he said or did in the moments of his arrest, the evidence in the trunk was not going to be argued away, and whatever story he told about how it got there was not going to be sufficient to explain the presence of jewels from 9 or 10 or 11 separate theft reports, all sitting together in a piece of luggage in his house. The trial of Evelyn Romadka was exactly the kind of event that Chicago's newspapers in 1907 were designed to cover and to savor. It had everything. The beautiful, composed wife of a millionaire. The criminal lover. The abandoned husband. The double life. the false names, the dramatic arrest. The jewels spread out on a table for the jury to consider. The question, hovering over everything, of what had made a woman from a respectable background do something like this. A question that the newspapers addressed with the combination of moral outrage and barely concealed fascination that is still, more than a century later, the characteristic tone of this particular kind of story. Charles Romadka was there. He had made the journey from Milwaukee, and his presence in that courtroom must have been its own kind of ordeal. The public display of a private devastation, the transformation of a marriage into a news story, the experience of having your life examined by strangers who are enjoying the examination. He had information that the court needed. He answered questions. He was, by all accounts, quiet and controlled, and gave no indication of what any of this was actually doing to him on the inside. Evelyn, for her part, was represented by counsel and maintained through the legal proceedings much the same composure she had maintained through the arrest and the questioning. She had confessed. The evidence was what it was. The question of guilt was not really in dispute. What was in dispute, to the extent that anything was the question of motivation, the question of what it meant that she had done this for love, whether that was a mitigating circumstance or an aggravating one, or simply an explanation that changed nothing about the facts while changing everything about how you felt about them. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, they had decided that love was not, in this jurisdiction, a defense against burglary. Both Evelyn Romadka and William Jones were convicted. Both were sentenced to prison. The sentence imposed on Evelyn was a year in the penitentiary. William received a longer sentence, as the principal receiver of the stolen goods. The judge, in sentencing, made remarks that the newspapers quoted at length. Remarks about the peculiar tragedy of a woman of good background and education who had allowed herself to be led astray by an unworthy man. Remarks that carried the particular flavoring of that era's ideas about women and agency and moral responsibility that I notice without endorsing. She went to prison. The sentence was served. The year passed. The prison records do not tell us very much about those months. Whether she had visitors, whether Charles came, whether her daughter was brought to see her, whether she had conversations with other women in that institution that changed her thinking in any direction. The year passed in the way that years in prison pass, which is to say more slowly than years outside, and then it ended. Charles Romadka divorced her. The daughter remained with him. These are facts that the newspaper accounts present as footnotes, almost afterthoughts, but that I want you to hold for a moment as what they actually were, the complete dismantling of the life that Evelyn had been given and then walked away from, and then been formally removed from by the mechanisms of law and family. She came out of prison in 1910 with no husband, no child, no home, no social position, and no obvious means of income. She came out of prison with the record of a convicted thief and the reputation of a woman who had chosen obsession over everything that society valued and expected of her. She was in her 30s. Her life, by almost any reasonable measure, should have been over, not physically, but in the social sense that mattered most for a woman of her time and class. She had been defined, publicly and permanently, as a particular kind of woman. The newspapers had made her a character in their own story, and the character they had made her was not one with a redemptive second act. And yet, within a year of her release from prison, her name began to appear again. Not on arrest reports, not yet, but in the conversations of investigators who were watching certain patterns of crime in the city and noticing that those patterns had a particular quality to them, a kind of elegance, a deliberateness, a patience that suggested someone with experience and skill. Reports of wealthy travelers who had been befriended in hotel bars or restaurant dining rooms, who had accepted an invitation for drinks, who had woken the next morning in their hotel rooms with the particular groggy confusion of someone who has slept longer and more deeply than normal, and who had discovered, upon taking stock of their situation, that their valuables were missing. The drugging scheme. The newspapers, when they eventually wrote about it, described it with a mixture of horror and theatrical admiration that told you more about the newspapers than about the scheme. But the scheme itself was real, and it was effective, and it targeted a very specific kind of person, the wealthy traveler, usually male, usually alone, usually in Chicago for a business or pleasure trip, and therefore slightly outside the social network that might otherwise have warned him away from exactly this kind of encounter. And the newspapers claimed that the woman at the center of it, The woman who organized the operation, who recruited the beautiful women who did the actual work of befriending and accompanying and proposing the fateful drink, was Evelyn Romadka. They gave her a title. They called her the Queen of the Vampire Women. The leader of a gang of female thieves who preyed on wealthy men, who used beauty and charm as instruments of theft the way other criminals used lockpicks and pry bars, who had turned the particular set of skills that Evelyn had developed over years of inhabiting other people's houses into something more organized, more scalable, more dangerous. Whether this was true, whether Evelyn was actually the architect of this operation, or whether the newspapers were constructing a more satisfying narrative than the evidence strictly supported, that is a question we cannot fully answer. The accounts are incomplete, and the accounts that do exist were written by people with a particular interest in making the story as dramatic as possible, which is not the same thing as making it as accurate as possible. What we know is that her name came up in connection with these crimes. What we know is that the police took the connection seriously enough to investigate it. What we know is that for a period of roughly a year after her release from prison, Evelyn Romadka was, in some capacity, connected to a network of criminal activity in Chicago. And then she disappeared. Not arrested again. Not tried. Not convicted of anything further. Just gone. Her name stops appearing in newspaper records around 1911, and after that there is nothing. No further arrests. No marriage. No death certificate that has been reliably identified as hers. No grave marker. No letter written late in life to a friend or a former acquaintance that might give us some hint of where she went and what she made of the life that remained to her after all of this. She simply ceases to exist in the historical record. She becomes one of those people who step off the edge of documented history and into a private darkness that no researcher has yet managed to illuminate. Perhaps she left Chicago. Perhaps she left Illinois entirely, went somewhere that her name and her story were not known, started over with a new name. She had proven herself adept at new names, and lived out the rest of her life in ordinary, unremarkable anonymity. Perhaps she died young, in circumstances that were not recorded or were recorded under the wrong name. Perhaps she is buried somewhere under a name that is not hers, and the grave marker says something that tells us nothing about who she really was. Perhaps she is still out there, in some sense. Or rather, perhaps the trace of her is still out there somewhere, in a document that no one has yet thought to connect to her, in a census record or a marriage register or a boarding house ledger, the ordinary paper trail of an ordinary life that she managed, at the end of all of it, to construct for herself. We do not know, and I think that uncertainty is one of the most important things about this story, because it means that the story does not have the satisfying closure that we often expect from narratives, the clean ending, the final account. It is open at the far end. Like most real lives are open at the far end, when you look at them closely enough, with enough honesty about how little we actually know. Breathe in. Let that go. Let us sit with Evelyn for just a moment more before we leave her. Not the Evelyn of the newspaper headlines, not the Queen of the Vampire Women, not the dramatic figure in the cafe with the alligator skin pocketbook. Let us sit with the Evelyn who stood in a schoolroom in northern Wisconsin and watched the light change on the pine trees outside the window and felt, without quite knowing what to do about it, that her life was going to be something more complicated than what it currently appeared to be. She was right about that. Whatever else she was right about that. And somewhere, in a city or a town or a house that we cannot identify, she woke up on some quiet morning in some year after 1911 and made coffee and looked out the window and thought about who she had been and what she had lost and what, if anything, remained. We honor her by remembering her completely. Not the story, but the person. Not the crime, but the woman. Complicated and real and, like all of us, more than any single version of herself. Let us breathe together. Let the rain settle around you. We have one more story to tell tonight, and then we will let you sleep. And if you are still with me right now, I just want to say thank you. Truly, it means something that you are here, that you have listened this far, that you gave your attention to a woman who lived more than a century ago, and who the world largely forgot. That matters. You matter. If you have not already, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find stories like this one, and it tells me that the work we are doing here together is worth continuing. And now, if you are settled, if the blanket is pulled up and the room is dark and the weight of the day has finally begun to lift from your shoulders, Let us go somewhere else. Tonight, I want to take you to a different kind of place. Not a city this time, but a small town. The kind of small town that exists in every state in America, in every country in the world, probably. The kind of place where everybody knows the name of the family 3 houses down, where the local diner has been operated by the same family for 3 generations, where the high school football team is the central civic institution and the church on the corner is the second one, where the rhythms of the seasons organize the year in ways that feel both limiting and deeply comforting. I want to take you to a place like that, sometime in the middle of the last century. A place that looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was: quiet, ordinary, self-contained, unremarkable in all the ways that quiet places are unremarkable until something happens that makes them the kind of place that people remember. And I want to introduce you to a woman who lived in a place like that. A woman whose name I will give you in a moment, but who I want you to meet first as she would have wanted to be met, not as a headline, not as a case number, but as a person, as the specific, irreplaceable, entirely particular human being that she was. She had a house. The kind of house that accumulates character over decades, that is layered with the evidence of a life being lived in it. The worn path in the hallway carpet from years of the same shoes walking the same route from the front door to the kitchen. The marks on the door frame in the kitchen where children's heights had been measured and dated and never quite painted over. The particular way the third step from the bottom creaked in a voice that everyone who lived there knew so well that they stepped over it automatically without thinking about it. Her house had all of those things. She had a garden. She was the kind of person who took gardens seriously, not as a hobby, but as a practice, as something that required the same kind of patient attention and informed judgment that a craftsperson brings to their work. She knew the names of things. She could tell you, without consulting a reference, the difference between perennials that needed to be divided every 3 years and those that could be left alone, between the soil amendments that helped and the ones that promised more than they delivered. Her neighbors sometimes asked her about their gardens, and she always helped, and she was good at making it feel like a conversation rather than a lesson. She had routines. This is the part that I always want to spend time on in stories like this, because routines are the most human thing, the most specific thing, the thing that tells you more about who a person actually was than almost anything else. Her morning routine was her own, shaped by decades of repetition into something that fit her exactly. Coffee before anything else. Always, the particular kind and the particular strength that she had arrived at through years of experimentation and refinement. The newspaper, folded in the specific way she preferred to read it, sections in a particular order. The walk, if the weather permitted, which in this town it often did, out along the road that ran past the school and the church and down to the edge of the small park where the old men played chess on Saturday mornings in the summer. She was known. Not famous, not notable, just known, in the way that people are known in small towns where being known is the natural condition of being. She was the woman from the house with the garden on the corner of that particular street. She was the one who had brought food when the Hendersons had their trouble, years ago, and the one who had organized the neighborhood response to the drainage problem in the alley behind the houses on the east side of the block. She was present in the small, consistent way that makes a community feel like a community rather than just a collection of buildings with people in them. I want you to hold this. Hold the ordinariness of it, and hold the value of it. Because the ordinariness of a life is not a diminishment. It is, in many ways, the highest expression of what a life can be. The choosing, day after day, of the small acts of care and presence and reliability that make other people's lives a little easier, a little warmer, a little less lonely. The woman I am describing was, in this sense, extraordinary, just in a way that the world does not often think to call extraordinary. Her name was Ruth, and one October morning, Ruth did not appear for her walk. The old man on the corner, who watched for her, the way neighbors in small towns watch for one another, not intrusively but faithfully, the way you notice the presence of something familiar and notice its absence. Notice that she had not gone past. He thought nothing of it at first. The weather was cool, and perhaps she had decided to stay in. Perhaps she had an errand. Perhaps she was simply having the kind of morning where the walk does not happen, which happens to everyone. But later that morning, when he walked past her house on his way to the hardware store, the newspaper was still in the box. And Ruth's newspaper was never still in the box at this hour. She was always up, always had the paper inside. Always had it read and folded and set aside before most of her neighbors had finished their first cup of coffee. He walked up to the front door. He knocked. There was no answer. He tried again. Still no answer. He was not yet worried. Exactly. There are so many ordinary explanations for someone not answering their door. They were in the back of the house. They were in the shower. They had gone out early before he noticed. They were on the telephone. They were absorbed in something and had not heard the knock. But there was a feeling at the edge of his awareness, a small and insistent feeling that he could not quite locate or name, that made him try a third time instead of turning around and going on to the hardware store. No answer. He went home and called Ruth's daughter. Ruth's daughter, who lived 40 minutes away in a larger town to the east, who called her mother every Sunday without fail and had spoken to her just 2 days ago, who had no particular reason to worry, but who drove to her mother's house immediately anyway because the neighbor's voice had had something in it that she recognized without being able to name. The daughter let herself in with her key. The house was as it always was, neat, particular, the evidence of a life organized along consistent and loving principles everywhere apparent. The coffee maker was clean and empty. The newspaper was in the box. The plants on the kitchen windowsill had been watered recently. The soil was still dark with moisture. Ruth was not in the house. They called the police. The police came. The police walked through the house and found what the daughter had found. Nothing wrong. Nothing disturbed. Nothing that suggested violence or intrusion or anything other than the simple, baffling absence of the woman who lived there. Her coat was on the hook by the door. Her keys were on the kitchen counter. Her purse was on the chair in the bedroom. Her wallet inside it with her money and her identification undisturbed. She was gone without her coat, without her keys, without her wallet. On a cool October morning, the search began. The neighbors came together with the particular, quiet urgency of people who know someone and therefore cannot pretend that they do not. They walked the roads and the park and the fields at the edge of town. They knocked on doors and asked questions and called out her name in the October air, which carried the sound differently than summer air does. Further, somehow, and more clearly, and at the same time more emptily. Nothing. The police expanded the search. They contacted hospitals. They checked the records of nearby towns. They spoke to everyone who had seen Ruth in the days before she disappeared, at the grocery store on Thursday afternoon, at the library on Friday morning, at the pharmacy in the afternoon where she had picked up a prescription. All of these sightings were ordinary. None of them suggested anything out of the ordinary. In each of them, Ruth was precisely herself, present, composed, purposeful. Whatever had happened to her had happened between the pharmacy on Friday afternoon and the Sunday morning when the neighbor noticed the newspaper in the box. Somewhere in those 36 hours or so, Ruth had been in her house, and then she had not been. Her daughter went through the house with the desperate, meticulous attention of grief that is not yet grief because the body has not yet been found. She looked for letters, for notes, for any indication of a plan or a fear or a trouble that Ruth had not shared. She found the ordinary documentation of an ordinary life, bills, correspondence, the practical paperwork that accumulates in every household, but nothing that explained anything, nothing that pointed anywhere. The weeks passed. The police investigation continued, and then slowed, and then reached the state that investigations sometimes reach where the activity continues, but at a different pace, with a different urgency, shaped by the absence of new information and the pressure of other cases, and the simple human difficulty of maintaining a high level of focus on a problem that refuses to offer new leads. Ruth's daughter never stopped. This is the part that I want you to know, and that I want you to feel the weight of. She drove out to her mother's house every weekend for months. She walked the routes her mother had walked. She made inquiries and followed up on suggestions and contacted everyone she could think of who might know something that they did not yet know they knew. She kept her mother present in the world through the force of her own refusal to let go, posting updates on community boards and speaking to the local newspaper and doing all the quiet, exhausting work of keeping a missing persons case alive when the official investigation has run out of forward momentum. Nothing was ever found. Not Ruth, not an explanation, not a single piece of evidence that resolved the essential mystery of what had happened on that October weekend. There was speculation, as there always is, the particular kinds of speculation that attach themselves to missing persons cases involving elderly women, the practical and the criminal and the medical, The possibilities that range from the heartbreaking to the terrible. None of the speculation was ever confirmed. Ruth is still listed as a missing person. Her file is still technically open. Her daughter still, some years after the disappearance, puts fresh flowers on the front steps of the house on Ruth's birthday. The house that belongs to someone else now, that has been repainted and the garden replanted, and the third step from the bottom finally fixed, so it no longer creaks in that particular, familiar voice. But the daughter brings flowers anyway, because what else do you do with a grief that has no ending point, a loss that has no monument, a person who is gone without being gone? You hold them. You keep them present. You tell their story, in whatever way you can manage, to whoever will listen. And perhaps that is the only answer. Perhaps holding is enough. Perhaps being the person who refuses to forget is the most important thing you can do for someone who cannot be found. Let us breathe together. Let us acknowledge the weight of what we carry when we hear stories like this one. Not the fear, exactly, though there is fear in it, but something older and more fundamental. The understanding that disappearance is possible, that a person can be present in all of the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable ways that people are present and then not be, and that the world does not always offer an explanation. That sometimes the only response that is equal to the mystery is silence, and care, and remembering. Ruth, we say your name. We hold it gently. We are glad you existed, and we are sorry for the ending that was not an ending, and we will not forget you. Breathe in. Let it go. You are safe. You are where you are supposed to be. We still have time tonight, my sleepy friends. The rain is still there if you are listening for it, and the night is still long. And there is still space for one more story before I let you drift. I want to ask you something before we go further, though. I want to ask you what it is you come here for, specifically, what it is about stories like these that draws you back night after night to this particular corner of the internet, to this voice in the dark. I ask because I think about it. I think about you, out there in your various beds and your various cities and your various states of almost sleep, and I wonder what you are looking for. Safety, maybe. The reassurance that comes from knowing that something frightening happened to someone else, long ago, and you are here and you are intact. Or maybe something else. Maybe it is the witnessing. Maybe it is the act of paying attention to people who were not, in the official record, paid enough attention to. Maybe it is that. Whatever it is, I am glad you are here. And if you want to leave a comment, tell me your city, tell me what time it is, tell me what you are thinking. I would love to read it. I read every single one. You might not believe that, but I do. Now, let us go somewhere else. I want to take you to a city this time. A large city, the kind that does not have a single face but 1,000 faces, all of them real, none of them complete. The kind of city where a person can be known or unknown as they choose, where the anonymity is not an absence but a presence, where you can walk through the same neighborhood every morning for 20 years and still not know the names of the people in the apartment above yours. The kind of city where things happen, as they happen in large cities, at a pace and a scale that makes individual stories hard to track, hard to follow, hard to keep visible. There was a woman in this city. I want to tell you about her the way I always want to tell you about people, beginning not with what happened to her, but with who she was, beginning in the ordinary. Her name was Marion. She was in her early 50s, which in the actual experience of being 50-something in the 21st century is nothing like how 50-something is sometimes imagined from the outside. Not diminished, not finished, but very much in progress. She had a career that she had built over decades, the kind that had started as something modest and grown over time into something that she was genuinely proud of. She was a legal assistant at a firm downtown, and she had been there long enough that she knew where everything was and how everything worked and which of the attorneys to trust with a difficult situation and which ones to route around. And this knowledge was the kind that the firm could not really afford to lose, but also could not adequately compensate because it lived in her head rather than in any manual or filing system. She had 2 grown children, both of them living in cities that were not this city, both of them with their own lives in full progress. She spoke to them regularly. Video calls on Sunday evenings had become a ritual in the years since they moved away, a ritual that all 3 of them protected with something approaching religious devotion. She had a small circle of friends from work and from the neighborhood, and from a hiking group she had joined 3 years ago when she had decided, with characteristic deliberateness, that she needed to spend more time outside, and less time worrying about the things that accumulated in her head during the hours when she was sitting still. She lived in an apartment. A good apartment, on the 6th floor of a building with a doorman and an elevator that worked most of the time, and a view from the living room window of a stretch of the city that she had come to love in the way you come to love a view when you have watched it through enough different seasons and weather events and times of day that it becomes, over time, more yours than it ever could have been if you had simply admired it once from the street. She had a cat. His name was Gerald, which was a name she had given him with the specific irony of someone who understood that naming a cat Gerald was a choice that said something about her sense of humor, and she was entirely comfortable with what it said. Gerald was large and orange and profoundly indifferent to everything except meal times and the particular spot on the sofa that he had claimed as his own on the first day and had defended successfully ever since. She was, in summary, a full person, living a full life. With all the texture and specificity and private humor and small pleasures and accumulated wisdom and ongoing projects and complicated feelings and unresolved questions that constitute a full life. She had a sister, Diane, older by 4 years, and the kind of older sister who had been, at various points in Marion's life, variously admirable and infuriating and indispensable and impossible, which is the full spectrum of what an older sister can be when a relationship is healthy enough to hold that kind of range. They talked often. They had dinner together once a month, at a restaurant that they had been going to for 7 years because neither of them could think of a sufficient reason to go somewhere else, when this one continued to be exactly what they needed it to be. On the evening of a Wednesday in late November, Marion and Diane had dinner. It was the regular dinner, at the regular restaurant, and by all accounts it was a regular evening. The food was good. The wine was what it always was. The conversation moved through the topics that their conversations always move through. Work and children and the state of the world and the small particulars of their respective neighborhoods and lives. They paid the bill. They walked out into the November night together, which had turned cold and clear in the way that late November nights in northern cities do. The kind of cold that is clean and sharp and makes the sky look particularly dark and the streetlights particularly bright. They said goodbye at the corner where they always said goodbye. The doorman at Marion's building saw her come in, he said, at approximately 9:15. He held the elevator for her. She smiled and thanked him, as she always did. She did not appear the next morning to take Gerald to the veterinarian for his annual checkup. The appointment was in her calendar, and it was not like her to miss an appointment without canceling. The veterinary office called her cell phone and got voicemail. They called again in the afternoon. Still voicemail. Diane called that evening, expecting the usual brief check-in that sometimes happened after their dinners. No answer. She called Gerald a pet, though she found him deeply strange, and she was not worried yet. But she had the vague, hovering sense of something not quite right that comes when a person who is reliably responsive is suddenly not responsive. By Friday morning, when Marion had not returned a single call or message from anyone, Diane went to the building. The doorman let her up. She knocked on the apartment door. No answer. She used her emergency key. They had exchanged emergency keys years ago, the way sensible adult sisters do, and she went inside. Gerald was in the apartment. He was hungry in the specific, vocal way of a cat who has not been fed in longer than is normal. His water bowl was empty. The apartment was neat, in the particular way of a person who keeps their space organized and who had not, apparently, had time to make it otherwise. Marion's coat was on the hook. Her laptop was on the desk. Her reading glasses were on the coffee table next to a library book that was marked with a bookmark about a third of the way through. Marion was not there. Diane called the police. She called them immediately, without hesitation, without the apologetic uncertainty that sometimes delays these calls, without the internal negotiation about whether this constitutes a real emergency or an overreaction. She called them because she knew her sister, and her sister did not leave her cat without food and water, and her sister did not answer her phone for 2 days, and her sister's coat was on the hook, which meant that wherever her sister was, she had gone there without her coat on a cold November night. The police came. They took a report. They asked the questions that they ask, whether Marion had any reason to leave voluntarily, whether she had been having difficulties, whether there were any relationships in her life that might be a concern. Diane answered all of these questions as completely and honestly as she could. No, there was no reason to leave voluntarily, none that she knew of. No, Marian had not mentioned any difficulties beyond the ordinary ones. No, as far as Diane knew, there were no relationships that were concerning. She thought about the dinner. She tried to remember whether anything had been said that she had not fully registered at the time, any small thing that might have been a signal she had not recognized as a signal. She went back over the dinner in her memory with the particular, anguished thoroughness of a person who is trying to find something they may not have been looking for when they should have been. Nothing. The dinner had been the dinner. It had been ordinary and warm and good, and she had said goodbye at the corner without any premonition that it was the last time she would say goodbye to her sister on that particular corner after that particular restaurant dinner. We do not know what happened to Marian. I want to be careful to be clear about that, to say it plainly rather than letting the not knowing remain implicit and thereby more frightening than it needs to be. We do not know. The investigation that followed found no physical evidence at the scene, no indication of a struggle or intrusion in the apartment, no clear indication of what had happened between the moment the doorman held the elevator and the Friday morning when her sister found an empty apartment and a hungry cat. The case is open. The family has not stopped. Diane, in particular, has dedicated herself to keeping her sister's name in circulation, to making sure that the investigation does not become merely a file in a cabinet. She has spoken to journalists. She has attended forums on missing persons investigations. She has maintained the presence of her sister in the public awareness with the particular tenacity that comes from love and refusal. And the Sunday video calls no longer happen. The restaurant still exists, on that same street, serving the same food that Marian liked. Gerald has been adopted by Diane, who finds him less strange than she expected, and who has developed the habit of speaking to him in the evenings the way people speak to animals when they need to say something to someone who will not tell them that it is time to move on. We say Marian's name. We hold her here, in this space, where people who were missed do not cease to matter simply because the official record has run out of new entries. She was here. She is still here, in every sense that matters to the people who loved her. Breathe in. Let that go. You are safe. You are where you should be. If this story moved something in you, if the weight of it settled in your chest in the particular way that true things settle, please leave a comment. Tell me her name meant something to you. Tell me you listened all the way to the end. That is how we keep people present. That is how we refuse to let the forgetting win. The night is getting quieter now, isn't it? The hour is later. The thoughts are slower, the way thoughts get when the body is finally beginning to insist on rest. I can feel it in the rhythm of the stories. We are moving into the deeper hours, you and I. The hours that belong to the almost asleep, when the edges of things begin to soften and the distance between waking and dreaming gets porous and uncertain. This is a good place to be. This is exactly the right place. I want to tell you one more story before we let the night take over completely. A different kind of story this time. Not of a millionaire's wife or a missing woman in a modern city, but of something older and stranger and more elemental. A story that belongs to the part of history that is close enough to feel almost familiar and far enough away to feel like another world. A story about what women were permitted to be, in a time when what women were permitted to be was very precisely and very deliberately constrained, and what happened when a woman decided, quietly, privately, without fanfare, that the constraints were not going to hold her. I want to take you to New York City. But not the New York City of now. The New York City of the 1880s and 1890s. The city of elevated railways and gaslit streets and tenement buildings packed with immigrants who had arrived from every corner of Europe with everything they owned in a single bag, and the particular desperate optimism of people who have bet everything on a single possibility. The city of the Gilded Age, which is what we call it now. That particular era of American history when the gap between the very rich and the very poor was so vast and so visible and so entirely accepted as the natural order of things that it is, viewed from this distance, almost vertiginous. In this city, in this era, there lived a woman named Nellie. And Nellie had decided, with the specific, clear-eyed decisiveness of someone who has thought something through all the way to its logical conclusion, that she was going to be a journalist. This was, in the 1880s, not a small decision. Women were not journalists in any significant number in that era. Women wrote, certainly. The literary tradition had a place for women, the domestic advice column had a place for women, the sentimental fiction market had a place for women. But the newsroom, the actual, functioning newsroom of a major metropolitan newspaper, with its cigar smoke and its professional cynicism and its constant, aggressive engagement with the actual facts of the actual world. That was not a place where women were welcome, expected, or in most cases permitted. Nellie knew this. She had known it for years, had bumped against it repeatedly in the earlier part of her career, had been told in various explicit and implicit ways that her ambition was misdirected and that she should redirect it towards something more appropriate. She had, instead, redirected herself toward New York, which was, she calculated, the place where the biggest newspapers were, and therefore the place where the most interesting journalism was happening, and where, if she could manage to get in the door and demonstrate her value, the objections to her presence might eventually be overwhelmed by the evidence of what she could do. She got in the door. I will not tell you that it was easy, because it was not. The negotiations and the persistence and the specific, strategic presentation of herself and her abilities that it required to get the editors of a major New York newspaper to give her an assignment. Those are their own story, long and complicated and worth telling separately. What I want to tell you about tonight is what happened after she got the assignment. Because the assignment she got was one of the strangest and most audacious pieces of journalism of the 19th century. And it began, as the most audacious things often do, with a question that most people would not have been willing to ask, because the answer required doing something most people would not have been willing to do. The question was, what actually happens to the women who are committed to insane asylums? It was a question that the public had a complicated relationship with in the 1880s. The asylum system was, on paper, a humanitarian institution, a response to the suffering of people whose minds had been injured by illness or circumstance, a place where they could receive care and treatment and protection from a world that did not always know how to accommodate them. The asylums were large and institutional and funded by the state, and they processed thousands of people a year, and almost nothing that happened inside them was visible to the general public, because the general public was not invited in, and the people who were inside were, by definition, not in a position to report on their own conditions. There were rumors. There were stories that made their way out through the families of patients, through the occasional former staff member, through the very rare patient who was eventually released, and who was willing to talk about what they had seen. The rumors were not good. They suggested conditions that fell far short of the humanitarian ideal: overcrowding, neglect, treatments that had more to do with control than with cure, a system in which the line between care and incarceration had become blurred to the point of being essentially meaningless. But rumors were not journalism. Rumors were not evidence. What was needed was someone who could go inside and see for themselves and come back and tell the truth about what they had found. Nellie went inside. She checked herself in. This is, when you think about it for more than a moment, one of the more extraordinary acts of journalistic courage that you will find anywhere in the history of the profession. She presented herself at the gates of the asylum, Blackwell's Island, in the East River, connected to Manhattan by a short boat ride that had all the characteristics of a one-way passage for most of the people who made it. And she presented herself as a woman in need of care, as a woman whose mind was not reliable, as a woman who required the supervision and treatment of an institution. And she was committed, without much difficulty, without extensive evaluation or consideration. A woman who presented herself as mentally unstable was, in the 1880s, taken at her word in a way that had very little to do with the actual state of her mind and very much to do with the systemic assumptions about women and their mental reliability that were built into the institutional culture of the time. She spent 10 days on Blackwell's Island. 10 days is not a very long time, but it was long enough. Long enough to see the overcrowding, the wards packed with women who had nowhere else to go, women who had been committed by husbands or families who had found them inconvenient, women who were poor and immigrant and had no one to advocate for them, women who had perhaps genuinely needed help and had received instead a kind of warehousing that would make them worse rather than better. Long enough to see the food, inadequate, and in some cases spoiled, served without regard for the dignity or the health of the people eating it. Long enough to see the treatments, the cold baths, the rough handling, the casual cruelty of attendants who had too many patients and too little oversight, and had long since stopped seeing the individual people in their care as individual people. Long enough to understand, from the inside, what it meant to be in a place from which you could not leave and from which no one who could change things was watching. She came out. The newspaper published her account. And what happened next is the part that I want you to hold, because it is the part of the story that makes it matter beyond the drama of the undercover assignment, beyond the personal courage it required, beyond the immediate horror of the conditions she described. What happened next was that things changed. Not immediately, not completely, not in the clean, satisfying way of stories where the brave act leads directly to the just outcome. But the New York State Legislature increased the funding for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections by more than $1 million. Conditions on Blackwell's Island were investigated and reformed. The system, the enormous, impersonal, badly managed system that had been processing women through its wards for decades without anyone looking too closely, was made to look at itself. Nellie's name was Nellie Bly, and she went on from Blackwell's Island to a career that included circumnavigating the globe in 72 days and reporting on the horrors of the First World War from the Eastern Front, and doing dozens of other things that people told her she was not permitted to do and that she did anyway because she had decided, at some point early in her life, that the permissions other people offered were not actually the ones that mattered. She died in 1922, at 57. She had lived a full life by any measure, and a remarkable one, and she left behind a body of work that changed things for real people in the real world. She left behind the 10 days on Blackwell's Island, and the $1 million of reform funding, and the women on those wards who had someone, finally, telling their story. And she left behind the question that her life poses to anyone who thinks about it carefully. If you believe that something is wrong, and you have the ability to make it visible, and making it visible requires something from you. Not everything, not your safety, but something significant. What do you do? How much is the act of witness worth? I do not have an answer to that. I am not sure the answer is the same for every person or every circumstance. But I think the question is one worth sitting with. Tonight, in the dark, in the quiet. I think it is a question that Nellie Bly spent her whole life answering, and I think her answer was consistent and clear and, in the way of things that are both true and costly, genuinely admirable. We say her name. We hold her accomplishment. We remember that the world is different because she was in it, which is the thing you can say about very few people, and which should be said about her, loudly and clearly and often. Breathe in. Let that go. Let the night come. You have done something good tonight by listening. You have been present with people who needed to be remembered, and that presence matters. Even when you are lying in the dark and the eyelids are heavy and the thoughts are beginning to soften into the particular formlessness that precedes sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The stories are done for now. Stay with me just a little longer, my friends. The night has grown very deep by now, and I know some of you are balanced on that beautiful, precarious edge between waking and sleeping, where my voice is perhaps more like water than like words, where the stories move through you without quite stopping anywhere. That is all right. That is, in fact, exactly what I hope for you. But for those of you who are still here, still listening, still wanting more, I have one more place I want to take you. One more story. One more person. And this one is different from the others. This one is about a man, which is less common on this channel. But this particular man's story has at its center a woman whose presence shapes everything, and I find that I cannot tell it without beginning with her. Her name was Clara. She was a botanist, a real one, with credentials and publications, and the particular kind of quiet authority that comes from spending decades learning one thing extremely well. She studied prairie plants, specifically the native grasses and wildflowers of the Midwest, the plants that had covered the landscape before the farms and the towns and the roads arrived and remade everything. She spent months of every year in the field, which in her case meant the fragments of original prairie that still existed here and there in Illinois and Indiana and Iowa and Kansas, small, preserved pieces of the original landscape, islands of biological memory in a sea of corn and soybeans. She loved these places with a depth that she sometimes found difficult to explain to people who had not seen them. The prairie in late summer, she would try to tell people, the grass is at their full height, 8 or 10 feet in some places, swaying in the wind that moved across it in visible waves, and the wildflowers brilliant against the green and gold and silver of the grass, and the light of a late afternoon in August coming low and amber through it all. The sound of it, the voice of it, which was the wind in the grass and the insects and the birds, and occasionally, if you were still enough and patient enough, the footstep of something large moving through it just beyond sight. She would try to explain this, and usually fail, and then she would invite people to come and see for themselves, and some of them did, and they understood. Her husband was named Robert. He was an architect, the kind who designed university buildings and civic spaces and libraries, the kind of work that requires you to think about how the physical environment shapes the human experience of being in a place, which was perhaps why he loved a woman who thought about landscapes the way Clara did. They had been married for 23 years. They had a house in a city in Indiana, a real house, a house with history in it, with a garden that Clara had planted with native species and that bloomed in a sequence from April through November that people came specifically to see. They had 2 sons, both grown, both the kind of adult children who answer their phones and show up when it matters and call without being asked. They were, by any reasonable assessment, happy. Not the simplified, photographic happy of people who do not have enough going on in their lives to generate real friction, but the complicated, earned, eyes-open happy of people who have been through things together and have chosen, repeatedly, to continue. This distinction matters. I want to make sure you understand that it matters. Robert disappeared on a Thursday morning in March. He left the house at 6:45, which was his normal time. Clara was up, they had coffee together, they talked briefly about the plans for the day. He was going to his office in the city center, where he had a 9 o'clock meeting with a client about a university library commission that he had been working on for months, and that he was, Clara would later recall, genuinely excited about. He took his coat and his briefcase, and he said goodbye, and he got in his car, and he drove away. He did not arrive at his office. The 9 o'clock meeting proceeded without him, with his associate standing in and fielding questions that nobody had prepared answers to. His cell phone went straight to voicemail all morning. By noon his assistant was worried enough to call Clara. Clara, who received this call while she was in the university greenhouse examining a seed collection and who went immediately still in the way of someone whose body has understood something before their mind has had time to catch up. Clara said she would try to reach him and hung up and dialed his number and heard the voicemail message that she had heard 1,000 times before and which, in this particular moment, had a quality that it had never had before, which was the quality of being the last thing she was hearing from him. She called the police. She drove home. She walked through the house checking everything that might tell her something. His phone was not there. His charger was still in the outlet by the bed where it always sat. His calendar was open on the kitchen table to March and showed the 9 o'clock meeting. Everything was as it should be. The house had the same face it always had. But Robert was not in it. And Robert did not call. And Robert's car, when the police found it that evening parked 2 miles from the house in a neighborhood that he had no obvious reason to be in, was locked and empty and showed no sign of having been involved in any incident. The investigation that followed was extensive and thorough and generated a great many questions and very few answers. His cell phone, when the records were examined, had been used to send a single text message at 7:03 in the morning after he left the house, before he should have arrived at the office, a message to a number that turned out to belong to a prepaid phone that was never located. The message said only that he would not be able to make it and would explain later. He never explained later. Clara became the center of her own story in the months that followed, in the way that the spouses and partners of missing persons always do. Both the primary source of information and the primary object of scrutiny, both the person with the most reason to want answers and the person whose own role in the situation was examined and re-examined and never quite fully exonerated or exonerated, because that is the nature of scrutiny in the absence of certainty. She was investigated and cleared. She cooperated completely with everything. She answered every question she was asked and several she was not, because she wanted them to know everything she knew, and she wanted them to find him, and she understood that wanting and achieving are different things. She never remarried. She continued her work, the prairie plants, the field seasons, the publications. She expanded the native garden at the house, which became, over the years, something that people drove from other states to see, which was perhaps how she chose to be present to him, by continuing to build the beautiful thing that they had built together. Whether he is alive somewhere, whether the disappearance was chosen, whether the life he had with Clara and the house and the sons, and the work he loved was something he walked away from deliberately, for reasons that she could not understand because she did not know about them, or whether something happened to him between 7:03 and the empty parking spot 2 miles from the house, something that ended the story in a way that has not been found, That is a question that remains entirely, painfully open. We hold Robert's name. We hold Clara's grief, which is the grief of not knowing, which many people who study grief say is one of the most difficult forms of it. The grief without a body, the grief without an ending, the grief that has to exist alongside the impossible possibility that the person is somewhere still. We hold it with care. We hold it with the respect that it deserves. Breathe in. Let it go. You are safe. And now, my sleepy friends, I think it is time. I think the stories are done for tonight, and I think the night is ready to take you. And I think you are ready to go. You have traveled so far tonight. From Chicago in 1907 to a small town in the present. From Nellie Bly's 10 Days on Blackwell's Island to a prairie botanist's front garden. From a schoolteacher in northern Wisconsin to every dark corner of every question that has no clean answer. You have been present for all of it. That presence matters more than you know. I want to leave you with something to carry into sleep. I want to leave you with the understanding that the people whose stories we told tonight, Evelyn and Ruth and Marion and Nellie and Clara and Robert, all of them were real. All of them were specific. All of them had the coffee they preferred and the way they folded the newspaper and the third step that creaked. All of them were more than the headlines that tried to contain them. And now you know them a little, in the particular way that listening lets you know someone. Not everything, not even most things, but enough. Enough to hold them. Enough to say their names and mean it. That is the work we do here. Not the investigation, not the resolution, but the holding. The remembering. The refusal to let the forgetting be the last word. Please, before you go, if this video moved you, if you found yourself drawn in and held and made to feel things you might not have expected to feel tonight, take a moment and leave a comment. Tell me which story stayed with you. Tell me what you are thinking as you close your eyes. And if you have not already, please subscribe. Please like the video. It is how this community stays alive, which means it is how the stories keep being told, which means it is how the people in them keep being held and remembered. Thank you. From the bottom of wherever it is that gratitude lives. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving your attention to people who needed it. Good night, my sleepy friends. You are safe. The rain is there. The dark is soft. Sleep well. My sleepy friends, you are still here. I can feel it somehow. The way you stay, the way this channel draws you back, the way the night and the stories and the quiet rain become something that belongs to you. That is yours in a specific and private way. I am glad. I am always glad when you stay. Before we continue, and we will continue, there is more tonight. There is always more. I want to ask you something. For those of you who have been with this channel for a while, who come back regularly, who have spent many nights exactly like this one, do you tell people? Do you tell your friends that this is what you do to fall asleep? I ask because I know some people keep it private. This particular ritual, this particular corner of the internet that they come to in the dark hours. And I understand that. There is something intimate about the way we do this here, something that belongs to the particular space between waking and sleeping that feels too private to explain in the daylight. But if you do feel moved to share, if someone you know is struggling to sleep, if someone in your life would find comfort in stories told this way, please share the channel. Please send them this video. The community here is built on exactly that kind of sharing, that quiet passing of something useful from one set of hands to another. And now, let us go back to Chicago. I want to return to Evelyn Romatka for a moment. I want to return to her because I have been thinking about her ever since we left her, in the earlier part of this night, vanishing into the historical record somewhere around 1911 and leaving no trace that any researcher has yet managed to find. I have been thinking about what that disappearance means, about what it costs a person to become invisible, about whether she chose it, finally, or whether it was chosen for her by circumstances that left no other option. Because here is what I keep coming back to. Evelyn was, by any account, exceptionally intelligent. Not in the ways that the world of 1907 was equipped to recognize or reward intelligence in women, but intelligent in the ways that matter. Observant, adaptive, skilled at reading situations and people, capable of sustained concentration and careful planning. The scheme she ran was not the work of someone acting impulsively or carelessly. It required patience and preparation and the kind of social intelligence that can only be developed through sustained attention to the way the world actually works, as opposed to the way it is supposed to work. She had all of that, and she spent it, at least for that particular period of her life. on something that destroyed the life she had been given, cost her a child and a marriage and a social position, and ended in prison. And then, upon release, she apparently went directly back to the work of finding another way to do the same thing, which suggests that the prison sentence had not resolved whatever it was that drove her toward the work in the first place. What was it? I keep coming back to this question, and I do not think the answer is simply a bad man. William Jones was clearly not an admirable person, and Evelyn's relationship with him was clearly destructive in ways that she either could not see or was not willing to acknowledge. But a bad man is not sufficient as an explanation for a woman of Evelyn's capabilities and evident strength of character. People do not sacrifice everything they have for a person without that person representing something to them that goes deeper than the person themselves. I wonder if what William Jones represented to Evelyn was the world she had caught a glimpse of from the schoolroom window in northern Wisconsin. The world that was not organized by rules she had not been consulted about. The world that was not asking her to perform respectability in exchange for a life she had not entirely chosen. The world that was fast and complicated and dangerous and alive in ways that the parlors of Milwaukee could not accommodate. I wonder if the crime was not, at its deepest level, about the jewels or about William Jones at all. I wonder if it was about the intoxicating, addictive experience of being fully herself, fully capable, fully engaged, fully present. Even if herself was something that the world was not going to permit her to be. This is, I want to be clear, speculation. I am not excusing what she did, which caused real harm to real people and was wrong in ways that do not become less wrong, just because the person who did them was more complicated than a simple villain. But I am interested in the full picture. I am always interested in the full picture. The full picture of Evelyn Romadka includes the schoolteacher, includes the woman who loved a man well enough to marry her despite his family's opposition, includes the mother whose illness changed something fundamental, includes the woman in the cafe, composed and still, as though she had already accepted what was coming and had decided to meet it with dignity, includes whatever woman she became after 1911, in whatever life she managed to build in the historical silence that swallowed her. She was all of those things. She was real. And she lived in a world that did not have very many good options for a woman like her. And she made choices within that world that were sometimes brilliant and frequently terrible and always entirely her own. Let us hold her full picture. Let us not simplify her. She was not a villain. She was not a victim. She was a person, complicated and real, who made choices that shaped a life that we can only see the outline of, even now, even 100 years later. Now, I want to tell you another story. We have been spending time in Chicago and in the Gilded Age and in the particular world of women who were constrained by the expectations of their era, and I want to honor that thread by following it a little further. I want to take you to a different woman, in a different city, in a different time, but connected by the same invisible thread, the thread of women who found the official path too narrow and looked for other routes. I want to take you to Boston. The Boston of the 1890s, which was a city with a particular kind of self-regard, a city that believed in the importance of culture and education and the cultivated life, a city where the right family background mattered enormously, and where people took the question of moral seriousness with a gravity that, from this distance, seems both admirable and slightly suffocating. There was a woman in this Boston who had spent most of her adult life in the grip of a situation that the city had no official language for. She was in her mid-40s. She had been married once, briefly and badly, in her 20s, a marriage that had ended within 3 years in the quiet, humiliating way of marriages in an era when divorce was possible but expensive and shameful, and left both parties marked in ways that took years to stop matching. She had rebuilt herself afterward, the way women of that generation rebuilt themselves, through work, through the maintenance of appearances, through the cultivation of a small and dependable circle of people who knew what had happened and had chosen, generously, not to make it the only thing they knew about her. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small import business in the financial district. She was good at it, meticulous with figures, reliable, trusted with accounts that required not just numerical accuracy, but a certain discretion about the financial affairs of people who preferred their financial affairs to remain private. She had worked for the same firm for 11 years. She lived in a respectable boarding house on Beacon Hill, in a room that was comfortable if not spacious, with a landlady who was brisk and fair and who, if she had opinions about the proper scope of a single woman's life, kept them to herself. Her name was Harriet, and Harriet, in the autumn of 1894, did something that she had been contemplating for a long time, and that she had repeatedly talked herself out of, and that she finally did, on a particular Tuesday morning, with a steadiness that surprised her. She opened a second set of books. The import business she worked for, I will not give you its name, because the descendants of the people involved are real, and the story is not fully resolved in a legal sense, had, over the 11 years she had been there, moved from being a legitimately operated business to being something considerably more complicated. The principals had found, sometime in the late 1880s, that their position in the import trade gave them access to goods that could be moved through official channels in such a way that certain duties and fees were not incurred, and that the savings from these not incurred fees were significant enough to justify the risk of the not incurring, and that having a bookkeeper who was good at making numbers tell whatever story you needed them to tell was, in this context, an asset of considerable value. They had relied on Harriet's skill. They had also relied on what they assumed was her compliance, her need for the income, her desire to maintain the respectability that the position gave her, her understanding that there were not many options available to a divorced woman of modest means in Boston in 1894 who needed work that paid reliably. They were right about some of that. She did need the income. She did value the respectability. But they had miscalculated something important. They had assumed that need was the same as loyalty, that a person who depended on them was a person who belonged to them. Harriet opened the second set of books because she had spent 11 years watching the evidence accumulate, and the evidence was now significant enough that she could no longer look at it and call it anything other than what it was, and she had decided, on that particular Tuesday morning, with a steadiness that surprised her, that she was not going to be the person who knew and said nothing. The second set of books was meticulous. The same quality of attention she had given to the official books, given to the parallel record, the actual numbers, the actual transactions, the actual movement of money that the official books did not reflect. It took her months to compile. She worked on it in the evenings in her room on Beacon Hill, at the small desk by the window that looked out over the gaslit street, while the boarding house settled into its nighttime sounds around her. When it was complete, she took it to a lawyer. Not one of the lawyers whose names appeared in the import firm's records, which excluded a significant portion of the Boston legal establishment of 1894, but a younger man whose name she had found through a friend of a friend and who had, when she described in general terms what she had, looked at her with a steadiness of his own that told her she had found the right person. The investigation that followed was long and complicated and involved federal customs authorities and took nearly 2 years from her initial disclosure to any kind of resolution. During those 2 years, Harriet continued to work at the firm because she needed the income and because the lawyers had advised her to remain in place while the investigation developed, and because she was, in the specific and quiet way of someone who has made a difficult decision and is now simply executing it, equal to the task of being in that office every day and doing the work and giving nothing away. The firm's principals were eventually prosecuted. Several were convicted. The firm was dissolved. Harriet received a portion of the penalty recovery that federal law provided for whistleblowers in customs fraud cases, a sum that was not enormous, but that was, by the standards of her situation, significant enough to matter. It gave her options she had not previously had. She left Boston. She moved to a smaller city in New England where nobody knew her name or her history, and she established herself there as a bookkeeper for a different kind of business, a small publishing house, run by a woman, which published books that the larger Boston publishing houses had found various reasons not to publish, and which Harriet found, when she sat down at her desk on the first morning of her new employment and looked around the office and felt the quality of the air in the room, to be exactly the right place. She worked there for 30 years. She was, by all accounts from the people who knew her there, content, quiet and competent and occasionally surprising, and content. Her story is not, I realize, a missing persons case or a murder mystery or a tale of the kind of dramatic, irresolvable crime that this channel more often explores. It is a story about a woman who saw something wrong and found the courage to name it, and about what that naming cost her and what it gave her, and about the 30 years that followed in a small publishing house where the air was right. I include it tonight because I think it belongs alongside the others. because I think the full range of what women have done in the face of worlds that offered them limited options is worth honoring in all its variety. Evelyn Romadka chose crime. Nellie Bly chose undercover journalism. Harriet chose the second set of books. All three of them looked at the life that had been arranged for them and found it insufficient, and all three of them made their own arrangements instead, with whatever tools were available. We honor them all. We hold their different choices in our hands with the same care. We do not have to approve of all of them to understand all of them. Breathe in. Let it go. The night is deep and the stories have done what stories do. They have opened something in you. And the opening takes time to settle, and the settling is part of the work. You are safe. You are here. Rest now. I want to keep going tonight. I want to keep going because the stories are not finished with me. Even if my voice is beginning to take on that particular quality of the late hours, that slight softening that happens when the edge comes off everything. I want to keep going because you are here, and because the being here matters, and because there is more that wants to be said. Let me go back to Chicago one more time. Not to 1907, not to Evelyn and her alligator skin pocketbook and the cafe where Lieutenant Larkin sat with his coffee and waited. Let me go to a different Chicago, a different era, the Chicago of the 1920s, which was a city in the process of becoming something entirely different from what it had been 20 years before. The 1920s in Chicago. I want you to have a picture of it, because the picture matters for the story I am about to tell you. This was the era of Prohibition, which had gone into effect in 1920 and which had, within a very short time, produced an economy of illegality so vast and so well organized and so thoroughly embedded in the normal life of the city that the line between what was legal and what was not had become, for most ordinary people, almost meaningless. Speakeasies operated openly behind false fronts that fooled nobody. Police were paid to not notice things. Politicians were paid to not regulate things. The whole intricate machinery of organized crime that we now associate with this era was in the process of establishing itself, powered by the apparently infinite demand of a population that had been told it could not have a drink and had responded to this information with the particular stubbornness of people who know what they want. It was also, in spite of all of this, or perhaps because of it, an exhilarating time to be young and alive and in a city. The music was extraordinary. The fashion was astonishing. The sense that the old rules no longer applied, that the Victorian century and all its constraints had finally, definitively ended, was everywhere in the air. Women had just been given the vote. Hemlines had risen. The particular social code that had governed everything from how a woman held her fork to what she was permitted to say at a dinner party had fractured under the pressure of the war years and the subsequent relief of the war's ending. And in the fractures things were growing that had not been permitted to grow before. Into this city came a young woman named Vivian. She was 24 years old. She had come from a small town in Kansas, which she had left with $40 and a very clear sense of what she did not want and a considerably less clear sense of what she did. She had a friend in Chicago, a girl she had gone to school with who had made the same move 2 years before and who had written letters home describing the city in terms that made it sound like another planet. Louder, faster, more colorful, more dangerous, more alive. Vivian arrived in February of 1923, which was not the best time of year to arrive in Chicago, but which was when she could manage it, and she stepped off the train at Union Station with her suitcase, and her $40 and her friend's address written on a piece of paper, and she looked up at the ceiling of the station, which was the most spectacular indoor ceiling she had ever seen, and she felt. She would describe this feeling later, to anyone who asked. She felt like she had arrived. Somewhere that was already waiting for her. She found work quickly. Not the work she wanted, not yet, but work, a job at a department store on State Street, in the hosiery department, which was dull and repetitive and paid wages that were, after rent and food, approximately nothing, but which gave her a foothold in the city and a daily reason to be on the street, and in the world, and in contact with the particular kind of Chicagoan who went to large department stores on State Street in 1923 and who were, collectively, a more interesting cross-section of the city than anything she had previously encountered. She was interested in everything. This is the quality I want you to hold about Vivian. The way she moved through the city with her attention fully engaged. The way she noticed things and asked questions and followed up on the answers with more questions and generally behaved like someone who understands that the world is made of details and that the details are where everything important lies. She read the newspapers, all of them, not just the society pages, which most of the girls she worked with read, but the news sections and the political analysis and the crime reporting and the editorials, which she disagreed with frequently and volubly in the boarding house where she lived, to the considerable entertainment of the other residents. She started writing things down, not with any particular intention at first, just the habit of someone who processes experience by recording it. Observations about the city, fragments of conversations overheard on the streetcar, descriptions of the streets in different weathers. She had a notebook, and then another notebook, and eventually she had a shelf of notebooks, and she was spending her days off walking the city with specific purpose, going to neighborhoods she had not been to before, sitting in diners and laundromats and park benches, and listening to the particular music of a city in the process of being what it was. A man at the boarding house noticed. He was a journalist, an older man, established, the kind of journalist who had been doing it long enough that he had strong opinions about everything, including what constituted a good piece of writing when he saw one. And he had, in the course of a conversation that started as a debate about something he had read in her notebook over her shoulder, seen that she could write in a way that most people who wanted to write could not. He made some introductions. The way things happened in that era, in the informal economy of the press. A word in the right ear, a recommendation to a city editor who owed a favor, the quiet circulation of a few paragraphs that demonstrated what this girl from Kansas could do. She was hired by a small Chicago paper as a general assignment reporter. This was not unusual in the way that Nellie Bly's newspaper career had been unusual, because the 1920s were different from the 1880s, and women in newsrooms, while still not entirely commonplace, were no longer the radical provocation they had once been. But it was still a significant thing to be, and she was good at it in the way that people are good at things that are exactly right for them. Not merely competent, but genuinely, distinctively good, in a way that her editors noticed and her readers felt. She covered the city. She covered the speakeasies and the police and the politicians and the neighborhoods and the ordinary people whose stories the big papers didn't bother with because their names were not attached to enough money to make them newsworthy by the standards of the time. She covered women's stories specifically, not as a formal beat, not as something she was assigned, but as a matter of consistent attention and priority, the understanding that these stories were going undercovered and that undercovering them was a choice, not an inevitability, and that she was in a position to make a different choice. She covered the women who worked in the stockyards, where conditions were brutal and wages were inadequate, and the women who worked there were doing the same labor as the men alongside them for half the pay. She covered the women who ran the speakeasies, not the famous ones, not the ones connected to the organized crime families whose names filled the newspapers, but the small operators, the women who had seen an opportunity in prohibition and taken it, who were running establishments in their own living rooms, or in the back of their tailor shops, or behind the sewing circle that met every Thursday in the church basement. She covered the domestic workers, most of them black women who had come to Chicago from the South in the Great Migration of the war years, who were doing the same work that Evelyn Romatka had pretended to do for the purpose of theft, but doing it for real, for wages that reflected the city's assessment of both their labor and their humanity. She stayed. She never went back to Kansas except to visit. She built a life in Chicago that was, by any measure she applied to it, entirely her own. The city she had chosen, the work she had chosen, the people she had chosen, the particular quality of attention she had chosen to bring to the world every day. She retired at 67, after more than 40 years in the newsroom. She had a party. The people who came were astonishing in their variety. Politicians and labor organizers, and the grown children of the women from the stockyards who had remembered her name for decades, and the editor who had given her the first assignment, and a woman from the hosiery department at the State Street store, 80 years old and entirely intact, who had stayed in touch all that time because the friendship had been worth staying in touch. Vivian did not disappear. Vivian is not a missing person. Vivian's story does not end in mystery or darkness. I include her tonight because I think that matters. I think the stories of women who built what they wanted in the face of a world that did not fully invite them to build it are as worth telling, here in this space, as the stories of women who were lost. We hold all of them. The ones who were taken and the ones who stayed. The ones who made terrible choices and the ones who made brilliant ones. The ones whose names are in the criminal record, and the ones whose names are in the newsroom archives. We hold them all with the same gentle attention, because they were all real, and because being real is enough. Breathe in. Let it go. Rest is coming. The night is almost ready to take you. Subscribe if you haven't. Comment if the spirit moves you. Tell me which story tonight was the one that stayed. I will read every word. Good night for now, my sleepy friends. Not quite the end yet, but soon. Very soon. We are in the deep water of the night now, you and I, past the point where the mind runs on its own energy and into the place where everything runs slower, warmer, more underwater. The thoughts that come now are different from the thoughts that come at 10 in the evening. They have less urgency, less insistence, more willingness to simply float alongside you rather than demanding to be followed. This is the place where stories go when they are done, where the people we have spoken about tonight become part of whatever the sleeping mind makes of the things it has been given. I am glad you are still here. I am always glad. Let us go back one final time to Evelyn Romadka. Back to the beginning of her story. Not the arrest, not the confession, not the alligator skin pocketbook or the cafe or the trunk full of jewels in William Jones's house. Back further. All the way back to a schoolroom in northern Wisconsin. In the early years of the century. On a gray winter afternoon, when the light came in at an angle through the windows and fell across the desks in long pale rectangles, and the children were bent over their slates, and the room smelled of chalk and wood smoke. She stood at the front of the room. She was 20-something years old, and she had been doing this long enough that the routines were comfortable, the faces familiar, the particular challenges of each child known to her in the way that teachers know things, intimately and practically, without sentiment, but not without care. She was good at this. She was patient with the slow learners and stimulating to the quick ones, and she had, as the best teachers do, a gift for knowing which child needed what on any particular day. But the window was there every day, in every weather, showing her the same view. The schoolyard, the road, the fields beyond, the edge of the pine forest at the horizon. In winter it was white and silent. In spring it became what it was going to be, briefly and brilliantly. In summer it was green and full, and the whole green world pressed against the glass from outside and tried to get in. In autumn it burned. It always burned. And she looked at it. Every day, between the arithmetic and the penmanship and the reading aloud and all the small, necessary, meaningful work of teaching, she looked at it. Not obviously. Not in a way that would have told any particular child, on any particular day, that their teacher's attention was divided. But she looked. What did she see? What was in the view through that window that was different from what was actually there? I think she saw possibility. I think she saw the version of her life that was not this life. Not worse, just different, and different in the direction of more. More complexity, more sensation, more of the feeling that she was moving through a world that was fully alive and that she was fully alive in it. More of whatever it is that a person feels when they are doing exactly what they were built to do, rather than what they were permitted to do. She had been permitted to teach. Teaching was respectable, and it suited her abilities, and it was one of the few professional options available to a woman of modest means and good education in northern Wisconsin in 1900. She had been permitted to fall in love with a wealthy man who came through on a hunting trip and saw her and chose her. She had been permitted to move to Milwaukee and be a wife, and then a mother, and then, after the illness, something harder to name. Something the people around her called changed, with that slightly bewildered tone they used when they were trying to describe something they could see but not understand. What she had not been permitted was herself. Not the full version. Not the version that would look at an empty house in an elegant Chicago neighborhood and think, clearly and without panic, about which room to go to first and how long she had and what she was looking for. Not the version that could maintain a fictional identity for months without slipping, that could read people and situations with the same fluency that others read books, that could plan and execute and adapt and disappear and be, in the spaces between the planning and the disappearing, fully, terrifyingly present. She had not been permitted that version, and so she found it herself. I am not saying this to make the theft romantic. The theft was theft, and it hurt real people, and the families who came home to find their jewelry missing experienced something real and painful that they had not deserved. I am saying it because I think the full truth of a person requires that we look at all of them. including the parts that are uncomfortable, including the parts that we are not supposed to admire, including the parts that tell us something about the shape of the world they lived in and the options it offered them. The shape of the world Evelyn lived in. Let me try to give that to you, in the simplest terms I can manage. A woman in 1907 who was intelligent and capable and ambitious and restless had, more or less, the following options available to her: marriage, teaching, domestic service, some forms of factory work, some forms of artistic or literary work if she was very lucky and very talented and had the right connections, and various forms of charitable or social reform work that were considered appropriate outlets for female energy and intelligence. That was essentially it. The professions, law, medicine, finance, engineering, were not available to her in any practical sense, and the institutions that trained people for those professions were, with very few exceptions, not admitting women. The political sphere was not available to her. The ownership of property was constrained. The control of her own finances was constrained. The most basic choices about her own body and her own reproduction were constrained. Within those constraints, some women built extraordinary lives. Some found ways to use the permitted spaces so fully and so creatively that the constraints became almost invisible. But some did not. Some looked at the constraints and found them unbearable. Some found their way out through the spaces that the law and society did not bother to guard very well. The margins, the hidden economies, the underground worlds where the official rules did not quite reach. Evelyn found hers there. In the space between what she was and what she was permitted to be, she created a third thing. Something that was entirely her own, however destructive. I have been carrying this story all night, and I want to set it down now with the care it deserves. Evelyn Hromadka was not a heroine. She was also not simply a villain. She was a person who lived in a particular time and place and set of circumstances, who had particular abilities and particular limitations and particular hungers, and who made choices, some brilliant, some terrible, all entirely her own, within the world that was available to her. The world has changed since 1907. Not completely, and not in every direction, and there are still constraints, and there are still women looking out of windows at the version of their lives that is not quite available to them. But it has changed. And the fact that it has changed is in part because of the Nellie Blys and the Harriets and the Vivians. The women who looked at the constraints and said, quietly or loudly, or with a pen or with a stolen pocketbook, that the constraints were not acceptable and that they were not going to accept them. Even Evelyn is part of that story. Even her particular, destructive, morally complicated refusal to stay inside the lines is part of it. Not because theft is a feminist act, but because the refusal of a life that is too small is always, at some level, a declaration that you know your own worth, and that knowledge, however it expresses itself, however illegibly, however harmfully, is always a beginning of something. Let us hold her one last time. The schoolteacher with the window, the woman in the cafe, the phantom of the historical record after 1911, complicated and real and more than any single version of herself. We say her name, Evelyn Hromadka. We hold it gently. We release it. Rest now. Let the stories settle. Let the people you have carried tonight find their places in whatever you are building in your sleep. They will be there when you wake. They do not need you to hold them every moment. They are held. You are safe. The rain is still there, soft and consistent. The dark is the soft dark of the deep hours. The day is very far away. Let go. Let go. Let go. Sleep well, my sleepy friends. I will be here when you come back. I want to stay with you a little longer. Not forever. The night is deep enough now that even my voice should be growing quieter, should be letting you go. But there is one more thread I have not quite finished pulling, one more part of this night's story that I think deserves its time before the lights go all the way out. Let me take you back to 1907 one final time. Not to Evelyn. We have honored her fully now, I think, held her as completely as the historical record allows. But to the city around her, to Chicago in that year, in those specific months when everything was happening. Because there is a detail of this story that I have been holding back that I want to give you now, in this quiet hour, as something to carry with you. The Beck House. Labor Day, 1907. The unlocked door. We know what Evelyn found there. We know she took the alligator skin pocketbook. We know this was the theft that led, 3 days later, to the cafe, and to Lieutenant Larkin, and to the arrest that became the trial, that became the newspaper story, that became the legend of the vampire women. But what happened at the Beck house in the days after the theft? The ordinary aftermath. The human part of the story that the newspapers did not find particularly interesting, but that I find the most interesting of all. That is what I want to tell you now. Mrs. Beck, the woman whose pocketbook had been taken. Let us spend a moment with her. She was, by the newspaper accounts, a woman of good family and moderate wealth. Exactly the kind of woman whose home Evelyn had been targeting, the kind of woman who had the beautiful things that Evelyn was looking for. When she and her husband returned from their Labor Day outing and discovered the theft, she would have experienced the particular disorientation of finding that your home has been entered and your possessions taken. A feeling that is not simply about the monetary loss, or even primarily about it, but about the violation of the space you thought was secure. The discovery that the boundary between inside and outside, between yours and not yours, between safe and unsafe, is more permeable than you believed. She reported the theft to the police. She described the pocketbook in detail, the alligator skin, the brass clasp, the contents. She answered the investigators' questions. She waited. And then, 3 days later, a detective named Larkin called on the telephone to tell her that the pocketbook had been recovered and that an arrest had been made. And the name of the woman who had been arrested was Evelyn Romadka. I want you to imagine that phone call. The moment when a Mrs. Beck, who had been thinking of the thief in the abstract, a criminal, a servant, someone from the outside who had come in, heard a name and understood that the person who had been in her house on Labor Day was not a stranger in any simple sense, was a millionaire's wife, was a woman of roughly her own social class, or at least her own social circle's adjacent edges, was a woman who had walked out of a life in Milwaukee and found her way into the Beck house through an unlocked door on a holiday afternoon, and who had stood in the same rooms where Mrs. Beck arranged flowers and entertained guests and lived her ordinary, specific, irreplaceable life. What did Mrs. Beck think about that? What did she make of it? We do not know. She did not write it down, or if she did, the writing has not been preserved. She did not give interviews to the newspapers that were more extensive than was necessary for the purposes of the case. She lived the rest of her life in the ordinary, documented privacy of a person who was briefly adjacent to a news story and then stepped back out of it. But I think about her. I think about her because she is the part of this story that most of the accounts leave out. The ordinary person on the other side of the theft, the person whose home was the setting, whose life was the backdrop, whose unlocked door was the mechanism. She is not dramatic. She is not tragic. She is not the protagonist or the antagonist. She is just a person who was affected by what someone else decided to do, and who had to live with that in whatever way she managed. Most of the people whose names appear in crime stories are like Mrs. Beck. Most of the people who are affected by the things that happen are not the headline names, not the Evelyn Romadkas, or the William Joneses, or the Lieutenant Larkins. They are the ordinary people in the ordinary houses. The people who came home to find something gone. The people who answered a police detective's telephone call on an afternoon when they had expected nothing more eventful than dinner. The people who spent some portion of their remaining years occasionally thinking about an unlocked door and what it cost them and what it cost the woman who walked through it. We hold them too. The unnamed ones. The people who were present in the story without being the story's center. They mattered. They are not less real for being less documented. Mrs. Beck. We say her name, even though we do not know her first name. We acknowledge that she was there, and that what happened in her house that Labor Day afternoon was something that happened to her, and that her experience of it was real and particular and deserving of recognition. Breathe in. Let it go. Let all of them go. Evelyn and William and Lieutenant Larkin and Mrs. Beck and Charles and the daughter whose name history has not preserved, and the women in the other houses, and the women on Blackwell's Island, and Harriet with her second set of books, and Vivian walking the city with her notebook. Let them all settle into the deep, warm dark. They are held. You held them tonight. That is enough. There is one more thing I want to tell you before the night takes over entirely. One more thing about the nature of this kind of story, the kind that involves real people and real crimes and real consequences in the real world. The reason these stories have power, the reason you come back to them night after night, the reason this channel exists and you are here and we do this together, is not because crime is entertaining, though I understand that there is something in the human brain that finds a compelling story compelling regardless of its content. The reason these stories have power is that they are true. The things that happened, happened. The people were real. The consequences were real. And the questions, the big, unanswerable questions about why people do what they do, about what the world does to people, about what options were available, and what was chosen, and what was forced, and what was something in between, those questions are real too. And the questions matter more than the answers, I think. The questions are what keep us honest. The questions are what prevent us from turning a human being into a cartoon, a simple story with a simple lesson. A woman stole jewels for a man she loved. That is a sentence, but it is not a story. The story is everything around that sentence. The schoolroom window, the operation, the Milwaukee parlor, the classified ads, the Chicago cafe, the prison year, the historical silence after 1911. The story is the whole complicated, contradictory, irreducibly human thing. We do the stories justice when we hold the whole thing, when we resist the simplification, when we stay in the question long enough to feel its actual weight. You have done that tonight. You have stayed. You have listened all the way through. And I am grateful. If you are still awake, if the eyes are open and the mind is still moving, please drop a comment. Tell me you are here. Tell me which part of tonight's stories you are still carrying. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is and what you can hear from your window right now. I want to know. I always want to know. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It costs you nothing and it makes everything possible. This channel, these stories, this late night community of people who listen in the dark. Subscribe. Like the video. Share it with someone who needs to sleep and cannot quite get there. Now, let the stories rest. Let yourself rest. My sleepy friends, we are in the very deepest part of the night now. I can hear it in the quality of the quiet. That particular stillness that settles sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning, when even the city sounds have mostly ceased, and the world is as close to genuinely silent as it gets in the 21st century. If you are still awake, you are one of the faithful ones. The ones who need the whole thing, who cannot settle for less than the full length of the night. I am here with you. I am not going anywhere. Let me tell you one more story. A smaller story this time. Smaller in scale. I mean, not smaller in importance, because I do not believe any story is small if it is a true one and a human one. A story about a woman and a house and a decision she made that changed everything without anyone knowing it had happened. The year is 1932. The place is a small town in Ohio, in the middle of the Depression, which in practical terms means that the town looks like it did before the Depression, except that there are more men standing outside the hardware store in the middle of the day and more doors on the main street that have closed signs in the window and more children who bring lunches to school that are smaller than they used to be and who are very careful not to call attention to this. In a house on the edge of town, the kind of house that is big enough to have once been prosperous but that is not quite keeping up with itself anymore, with peeling paint on the porch columns and a garden that was once formal and is now simply overgrown, there lives a woman named Agnes. Agnes is 61 years old. She was born in this town and she has lived in this house for her entire adult life. She married at 20, a man who was by most accounts a decent person, not brilliant, not difficult, just ordinary in the way of most people, with his particular virtues and his particular limitations, and she had been married to him for 33 years when he died of a heart attack in 1930, 2 years before we arrive at this moment in the story. She lives alone now. The children, she had 3, have moved away to other towns, other states. The general dispersal of adult children that the Depression both accelerated and made more painful than it might otherwise have been, because dispersal during the Depression was not the hopeful kind, not the young people going off to make their fortunes, but the necessity kind. The following of work wherever work could be found. They write when they can. They send money occasionally, when they can spare it. They worry about her, in the abstract and from a distance. She is not, Agnes, a woman who advertises her circumstances. She presents to the town exactly what she has always presented. A certain contained, competent dignity, the face of someone who manages. She is active in the church. She takes in sewing, which she has always done and which provides a small but reliable income. She tends the garden, which has become less formal but is still producing vegetables that she eats and preserves and occasionally gives to neighbors who she knows need them without saying so. She is careful, precisely, consistently careful, with every resource she has. In June of 1932, a letter arrives. It is from a man she has not seen in 40 years, a man she knew when she was a girl, before the marriage, before the house, and the children, and the 33 years of ordinary life. He is a lawyer, he explains in the letter, in a city 2 states away, and he has been engaged to settle the estate of a distant cousin of her late husband's, a cousin whose existence Agnes had not been aware of, and in the course of settling the estate he has discovered that there is a bequest. Not a large bequest. The cousin was not a wealthy person, but it is something, a specific sum that Agnes reads and reads again, standing at the kitchen table with the letter in both hands, the morning light coming in through the window the way it always comes in at that hour, falling across the table, and the envelope, and her own familiar hands holding the paper. The sum is enough. That is the only way to say it. It is not enough to transform her life, not enough to resolve the broader fact of the depression or the distance between her and her children or the peeling paint on the porch columns. But it is enough. Enough to pay the tax bill that has been accumulating and that she has been managing not to think about too directly. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to carry her through another year or 2 of the depression without having to make a decision that she has been quietly dreading. She writes back to the lawyer. She arranges for the bequest to be transferred. She deposits it in the bank with the same contained, competent dignity with which she does everything. And then she does something that I find extraordinary and that I want you to hold. She goes to see 5 families in the town. 5 families that she knows, through the careful attention she has always paid to the life of the community around her, are in specific and serious difficulty. Not general difficulty. Everyone is in general difficulty in 1932 in a town like this. But specific difficulty. The kind where the combination of circumstances has put someone at a particular edge that they are trying very hard not to let show. She does not make speeches. She does not make her visits a matter of public knowledge. She goes, one by one, and she has conversations that are about ordinary things, the garden, the sewing, the church, the weather, and in the course of these ordinary conversations, at a particular moment that she has judged carefully in advance, she mentions that she has recently come into a small bequest, and she wonders if she might be able to be useful in some specific practical way. Not a gift, she is careful to say. A loan, if the word loan is easier, though she never intends to collect it. Something practical, addressed to the specific thing that she has quietly observed, and that she does not name, but that the other person knows she knows. She does this 5 times. She uses almost exactly half of the bequest. The 5 families are not asked to keep the visits private. But nobody talks about it very much, which is partly because the depression has a way of making people careful about the distances between what they show and what they carry, and partly because Agnes is the kind of person about whom talking in that particular way simply does not occur to people. She is simply Agnes. She is simply part of the place. She lives until 1958. She dies in the house she was born in, or near enough. The roof holds. The garden produces through 26 more seasons. The children come back when they can and eventually come back for good, or close enough. The town continues. I include Agnes tonight not because her story is dramatic or mysterious or tragic in the ways that make certain stories into headlines. I include her because I think she is the thing we are working toward, all of us, in the long work of learning how to be people. The quiet attention, the careful use of what we are given. The 5 visits, made without announcement, to people who needed them. She was ordinary and she was extraordinary, and she is gone now, and the world is different because she was in it, in small ways that cannot be measured but that were real. Genuinely, irreducibly real. We say her name. Agnes. We hold her gently. We are glad she existed. Breathe in. Let that go. Let it all go. You have come such a long way tonight, my sleepy friends. From Chicago in 1907 to a schoolroom in Wisconsin to Blackwell's Island to a prairie botanist's garden to a small town in Ohio in 1932. You have been present for all of it, for every name and every question and every moment of sitting with uncertainty. That presence is a gift to the people in the stories and to yourself. Being present is never nothing. Being present is always something. The dark is very soft now. The rain, if you are still hearing it, has the quality of the late hours, unhurried, without direction, simply falling because that is what it does. There is nothing else needed tonight. There is only the dark and the rain and the slow approach of sleep, which is not an ending but a continuation, the body and the mind doing in the dark what they do when we let them. Let them. Let the night take you. Let the stories you have carried tonight find their places in you. They will be there when you wake, lighter somehow for having been held through the full length of this night, ready to be part of the understanding you carry forward into tomorrow. You are safe. You are warm. You are here. I am grateful for you. Genuinely and specifically grateful for this community, for this practice, for every night that you choose to spend some part of here, in this particular corner of the dark, listening. Thank you. There is something about the very late hours that I want to speak to directly before we go any further. Something about what this hour feels like. The 4 or 5 in the morning hour, for some of you, or the midnight hour, or the 2 a.m. hour, wherever you happen to be in the arc of the night. There is a particular quality to this time. A particular quality of truth, I think. Things feel less defended at this hour. The distances between feeling and thought, between what you know and what you acknowledge knowing, between the person you present during the day and the person you are when the house is quiet and the lights are off and no one is looking, those distances get smaller. The night is honest in a way the day is not always honest. This is why we are here, I think. This is why this works. Not because crime is the subject, but because honesty is the method, and the night is where honesty lives. Let me stay honest with you then, in this deepest part of the night. Evelyn Romadka's story has been sitting with me all evening. All through the other stories, Ruth, Marion, Nellie Bly, Harriet, Vivian, Agnes. Evelyn has been there in the background, this complicated presence that I keep returning to because I have not quite finished understanding her. I do not think I will ever fully understand her. I do not think that is the goal, but I want to try, one more time, to get a little closer. Here is what I keep coming back to. The daughter. Charles and Evelyn had a daughter. She is never named in the newspaper accounts. She is mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, as the child who remained with Charles after the divorce. And then she disappears from the story the way that daughters often disappear from the official histories of this era, subsumed into the paternal narrative, her own experience invisible, her own understanding of what had happened to her family unreported and therefore unrecorded and therefore, from the perspective of history, simply absent. But she existed. She was a real child, this unnamed daughter. She had a mother who had been present and then ill and then changed and then absent, who had been arrested and tried and imprisoned and divorced, and who had then, upon release, apparently returned to a life of crime before disappearing entirely from the historical record around 1911. What was it like for this unnamed daughter to grow up in the shadow of this? In Milwaukee, in the Romadka household, with a father who had married against his family's wishes and whose wife had made international news for her crimes? What did the other children say at school, if they said anything? What did Charles tell her, in the simplest possible terms, when she was old enough to ask why her mother was not there? What did she carry with her, into adulthood and presumably into her own family, of this particular inheritance? We do not know. The historical record has swallowed her completely. This unnamed girl with her particular position at the center of a story that was not about her, but that would have shaped her entirely. I grieve this. I grieve the invisibility of her as I grieve many of the invisibilities in this kind of history. The children, the servants, the neighbors, the people who were present at the edges of dramatic events and who experienced those events as real and consequential parts of their own lives, not as dramatic events at all, just as things that happened while they were trying to live. I want to say her name, even though I do not know it. I want to acknowledge her existence and the reality of her experience, even though I cannot reconstruct that experience. She was there. She was loved, I hope, by Charles at least, who by all accounts was a man of genuine feeling, who had loved her mother enough to marry against his family's wishes, and who had presumably transferred that capacity for feeling to the child they shared. She grew up. She became someone. She had a life. Unknown daughter of Charles and Evelyn Romadka. We hold you here. We acknowledge that your story is part of this story, even if you are not in the record. You mattered. Breathe. Rest. I want to give you, in this final hour of our night together, one more piece of Evelyn's story. One more thing that I have been saving. After her release from prison in 1910, in the period when the newspapers reported her involvement with the Vampire Women operation, the drugging of wealthy travelers, the gang of beautiful thieves, the title that the newspapers apparently gave her, with a mixture of horror and barely concealed admiration. In this period, there are traces of something else in the record, something small and easy to miss, but that I think is important. There are reports of a woman matching Evelyn's description who was seen, on several occasions, in the neighborhoods of Chicago where the domestic servant employment agencies operated, not applying for positions, not in any way connected to the criminal operation, just present in those neighborhoods, in the vicinity of the agencies. And there are, around the same time, reports from the matrons of a women's shelter on the south side of Chicago, one of the settlement house operations that was doing the early, crucial, underappreciated work of supporting immigrant women and women in difficult circumstances that the official social system was not equipped to support. That a woman of good education and evident intelligence had been seen helping with the sorting of clothing donations, speaking to the immigrant women in their own languages. She apparently had some German and some Polish, acquired from the immigrant communities in Milwaukee, assisting with the records. No name given. No connection established to Evelyn, except the physical description and the timing. I do not want to overread this. I do not want to turn it into a redemption narrative, because redemption narratives are often more satisfying to the person telling them than they are accurate to the person they are told about. But I notice it. I hold it as a possibility that somewhere in the years between the prison and the disappearance, Evelyn Romadka was also, in some capacity, doing something that moved in a different direction. That both things can be true simultaneously. That a person can be involved in a criminal operation and also be standing in a settlement house sorting clothing donations. That the human capacity for contradiction is not a failure of character, but a feature of it. That we are all, always, more than one thing at once. This is what I want you to take with you into sleep, if you take anything. The understanding that the people we talk about on this channel, the criminals and the missing and the ones who made terrible choices and the ones who made brilliant ones, all of them were multiple. All of them were, in the same moment, more than one thing. And our responsibility in holding their stories is not to flatten them into the single thing that makes the story most satisfying, but to hold the multiplicity, the contradiction, the full human mess of it. Evelyn Romadka, the schoolteacher. Evelyn Romadka, the millionaire's wife. Evelyn Romadka, the phantom thief of Chicago. Evelyn Romadka, the prisoner. Evelyn Romadka, the woman in the settlement house sorting clothing. Evelyn Romadka, the historical shadow after 1911, gone without explanation into whatever she became next. All of it is true. All of it is her. We hold it all. We say goodbye to her now, finally, with the respect due to someone who was real and complicated and entirely her own person, for good and for ill and for all the unmeasured territory in between. Goodbye, Evelyn. We will not forget. And now, my sleepy friends, I think we have come to the end of what this night has to offer. The stories are told. The names have been spoken. The weight has been held and acknowledged and gently, gradually set down. The dark has done its work. The rain has done its work. This voice, I hope, has done its work. You are safe. You are here. The people you love tonight are held in the large quiet place where all true things rest. You can let go now. You can stop holding and simply be held by the warmth and the quiet and the deep, honest dark of the very late hours. Sleep is right there. It has been waiting patiently all this time. It does not need to be chased or negotiated with or persuaded. It is simply there, the way it always is, on the other side of the final breath of the night, the one breath where you stop trying and simply breathe, and in the breathing let everything else follow. That breath, that is the one. Take it. Let go. Sleep well. The rain is still with you. I can hear it, in the space where I imagine you are, and it is one of the most reassuring sounds in the world, consistent and clean and entirely indifferent to the complications of human life in the best possible way. The rain does not know about Evelyn Romadka. It does not know about Ruth, or Marion, or Nellie Bly, or Agnes in her Ohio house. It just falls, which is what it does, which is exactly what you need it to do right now. I am still here. For those of you who have been with me since the very beginning of this night, who started in Chicago in 1907 with a detective named Larkin noticing a pocketbook in a cafe, I am still here. We are near the end now. Very near. But we are not quite at the end yet, and I want to use the remaining time carefully, because there are still things I have not said that I want to say before the night is done. I want to talk to you about what these stories do, not what they are about. We have been about it all night. We know what they are about, but what they do. What happens in you when you listen to a story like this, in the dark, in the late hours, with the rain outside and the warmth in? I think what happens is something like this. You start the night as yourself, whatever version of yourself showed up tonight, with whatever it carried, the particular weight of today's particular concerns and worries, and the lower frequency hum of the longer worries, the ones that are always there even when you are not thinking about them directly. You show up as that person. And then the story begins, and gradually, gently, you are drawn out of your own interior and into someone else's, and for a while, for the length of the story, or as long as the story holds your attention, your own concerns are not the center of the picture. Someone else's. Someone real and long ago, or someone real and recent, or someone real and disappeared. Someone whose story matters in a way that is entirely separate from your own. And this is, I think, one of the most useful things that story can do. Not the escape from your own concerns. That is not quite what I mean. Because you come back to your own concerns at the end, as you always do, and the escape is temporary. But the temporary distance from your own center is itself useful. It creates perspective. It reminds you that the world is very large and very full, and that your particular set of circumstances, however heavy, is one configuration among an incomprehensible number of configurations, each of them just as real, just as specific, just as worthy of the kind of careful attention you have been paying tonight. It reminds you, in other words, of your own proportion. And proportion, the ability to see your own life in relation to the vastness of everything else, is, I think, one of the most important things we can develop. One of the most useful tools for getting through the long nights. Your worries are real. Your pain is real. Your load is real. And it is also one load among billions. All of them real. All of them being carried by someone who is doing the best they can with what they have. This is not a diminishment. Please hear me say that clearly. Your experience is not diminished by existing alongside other experiences. It is not made smaller by comparison. It is simply given its proper place in the world. The large world. The full world. The world that contains Evelyn Romadka and Agnes and Nellie Bly and Ruth and Marion and every unnamed person at the edges of every story we tell here. You are in that world. You belong in it. Your story, your particular, specific, irreplaceable story, is as worth telling as any of the ones we have told tonight. I want you to know that. I want you to carry it into sleep and let it be there when you wake. There is a specific kind of loneliness that the late hours produce, and I know many of you know it. The loneliness of being the only one awake, or feeling like you are, when the rest of the house is sleeping and the street outside is quiet and the thoughts have nothing to push against, and so they just keep circling. The particular 3 a.m. loneliness that makes everything feel more uncertain and more heavy than it does in the daylight. The sense of being unsupported, unwitnessed, alone with the full weight of whatever you are carrying. I know that loneliness, and I want to say, as simply and directly as I can, you are not alone right now. There are people listening to this video tonight, in every time zone in the world. There are people in the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada and Nigeria and Brazil and Japan and Norway and 100 other places who are also in their beds, also in the dark, also listening to this voice and these stories and finding in them some version of what you are finding. You are not the only one. You are never the only one. This community, this strange, wonderful, late-night community of people who listen to true crime stories in the dark to help themselves sleep, is a real community. It is made of real people who have real things in common. The curiosity, the desire to honor people who were overlooked, the preference for a particular kind of company in the particular vulnerability of the late hours. These are real things, and they connect real people, and you are part of that connection whether or not you have ever left a comment or acknowledged it in any way. You are held in this community. Right now, in this moment, you are held. And speaking of which, if you have been listening all this time and you have not yet subscribed, I want to ask you one more time to do that. Not for me, though it does help, but because subscribing is how you tell yourself, as much as anyone else, that this is something you value. That this particular corner of the night is somewhere you want to be able to find again easily. That the next time the late hours get heavy, you know where to come. Subscribe. Like the video, if it moved you. Leave a comment if you have anything at all to say, your name, your city, the time where you are, Which story stayed with you? What you were thinking about as the night ends? I read them all. I mean that. And now I want to give you one final piece of tonight's story. One final thought about Evelyn Romadka that I have been saving for this exact moment. Here it is. In the newspaper accounts of her trial in 1907, among all the dramatic reportage and the moralizing and the barely contained fascination that characterized the coverage, there is one small detail that is mentioned in passing and that I do not think any of the reporters who included it understood the significance of. When Evelyn was arrested and taken to the precinct for questioning, she asked, before anything else, before a lawyer, before a telephone call, she asked whether someone could arrange to have a message sent to her daughter. The daughter who was in Milwaukee with Charles. The daughter whose name history has not preserved. The daughter who is the invisible center of this story in many ways. The person most affected by all of it. The person least visible in the record. She asked for her daughter first. Let us sit with that for a moment. Whatever else Evelyn Romadka was, whatever the full picture of her choices and her crimes and her capacity for deception and her obsessions and her particular, difficult, irreducible humanity, in the moment of her arrest, her first thought was for her daughter. This does not change anything about the theft. It does not change anything about William Jones, or the jewels in the trunk, or the families who came home to find their pocketbooks gone. It is not a redemption, or an excuse, or a tidy moral lesson. It is just a true thing. A small, specific, entirely human true thing about a woman who was more than her worst choices and more than her best ones, and who, in a precinct room in Chicago in October of 1907, thought first of a child she had left behind. We hold that. We hold it with everything else we know about her, and we do not try to resolve the contradiction, because the contradiction is the point. The contradiction is the person. The contradiction is, in the end, all of us. Rest now. You have done something worthwhile tonight. You have been a witness. You have paid attention. You have held people, real people, complicated people, people who were gone before you were born or who are gone now in ways we do not understand, with care and with honesty. That matters. I promise you it matters. Let the rain carry you now. Let the warmth take over. Let the thoughts go soft and the eyes go heavy, and the long, complicated human day release you into the deep, forgiving dark. You are safe. You are loved, in whatever way this strange community loves its own. You are here. Sleep well, my sleepy friends. Sleep gently. I will be here when you come back. We are at the end now. The truest end. The last minutes of a long night spent in the company of people who were real and gone, and somehow more present for the telling. I want to spend these final minutes with you the way I try to spend the end of every night we share here. Not with a rush to the door, not with a summary or a lesson, but simply being present for a little while longer. Just the two of us, or the many of us. However many of you are still here, still listening, still balanced on the beautiful, precarious edge. I want to thank you. And I do not mean it in the quick, reflexive way that people say thank you at the end of things. I mean it specifically with the full weight of having been in this night with you. You chose to spend this night here. That is not nothing. The internet is infinite, and your attention is finite, and you gave some of it, the particular quality of attention that the late hours produce, which is softer and more open and more honest than daytime attention. You gave that to these stories and to these people. Evelyn Romadka, Ruth, Marion, Nellie Bly, Harriet, Vivian, Agnes, Robert, Clara, the unnamed daughter, Mrs. Beck. They were all here tonight. In whatever sense people are present when someone chooses to remember them. You made them present. That is a gift you gave them. I believe that sincerely. Let me, before I let you go completely, bring you back one final time to the beginning. To Chicago, 1907. To the cafe. To Lieutenant Larkin with his coffee and his careful, patient attention, watching a woman at a nearby table who did not know she was being watched. She was sitting very still. The alligator skin pocketbook was in front of her on the table, or held in her lap, or somewhere in her immediate vicinity. The exact position varies slightly between accounts. She had the composed stillness of someone who has learned to occupy space without disturbing it. She looked, to anyone who did not have a specific reason to look at her differently, like exactly what she was, a well-dressed woman, resting, entirely ordinary. But she was not ordinary. She was Evelyn Romadka, who had been a schoolteacher in northern Wisconsin and a millionaire's wife in Milwaukee and a phantom thief in Chicago, who had stood in the rooms of strangers and understood them from the inside, who had loved a man badly and well simultaneously, who had survived things that many people in her position would not have survived, who was sitting in this cafe with a stolen pocketbook and the particular stillness of someone who has run as far as running is going to take them, and who is, perhaps, almost ready to stop. 3 days earlier, she had walked into an unlocked house. She had found a beautiful pocketbook in a bedroom. She had taken it, along with everything inside it, and she had walked back out into the holiday afternoon and disappeared into Chicago with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this for a long time and is very good at it. And now she was sitting in a cafe, and a man across the room was recognizing the pocketbook, and the chain of events that would end with a confession and a conviction and a prison sentence was already in motion, had been in motion for days, and she did not yet know it. What did she think about in those last quiet minutes before everything changed? Was she thinking about her daughter? Was she thinking about William Jones? Was she thinking about the schoolroom window and the view through it and the version of her life that had looked so clearly possible from there? Was she simply thinking about what to order, or whether the weather would hold, or whether the woman 2 tables over was going to keep glancing at her in that particular way that meant something she could not quite determine? We do not know. We cannot know. That interior is closed to us now, as permanently and completely as every interior is closed. The specific, private consciousness of Evelyn Romadka on a particular afternoon in October of 1907, sitting in a Chicago cafe with a stolen pocketbook, on the last quiet day of a life she had built by hand in the ruins of the life she had been given. But we can imagine it. We can sit across from her, the way Larkin sat, and look at her with the same steady attention, not the attention of someone who wants to catch her, but the attention of someone who wants to understand, who wants to see the whole person, not just the crime, who wants to hold the contradiction without resolving it. The schoolteacher, the wife, the mother, the thief, the prisoner, the shadow after 1911, the woman who asked to send a message to her daughter before anything else. All of it at once. She is, in some sense, still sitting in that cafe. She will always be sitting there, in the particular way that people exist permanently in the stories that are told about them. As long as someone tells this story, as long as someone holds her name and her complexity and her full, irreducible humanity, she is there, composed, still, more than she appears. We say her name one final time, Evelyn Romadka, not as a judgment, not as a verdict, as an acknowledgement, as a refusal to let the forgetting be the last word. Evelyn Romadka. And now, my sleepy friends, it is truly time. The night has done everything it can do. The stories have said everything they have to say. The rain is still there, and it will keep being there long after this voice goes quiet, and you can listen to it as long as you need to. I want to leave you with a question, not a mystery, not something unsolvable or frightening, just something gentle to carry with you as you finally let sleep come. The question is this: who is the person in your life or in the history you carry who has never quite been seen fully, whose complexity has been flattened by the story that was told about them? Who deserves the kind of careful, patient, non-judgmental attention that we have tried to give tonight? The attention that holds contradiction without needing to resolve it. You do not have to answer that question tonight. You do not have to answer it at all. Just let it be there, soft and curious, as you drift. Let it be the last thought before the dark becomes complete, and then let the dark be complete. You have done well tonight. You listened. You stayed. You honored people who needed honoring. You sat with questions that do not have answers, and did not force them to have answers, which is one of the hardest and most important things a person can do. I am so glad you were here. I will be here again. Another night, another collection of stories, another voice in the dark for the faithful ones who need the whole thing. When you come back, I will be ready. Until then, if you are still awake and the comments section is calling, please leave me something. Tell me which story tonight was the one you will carry with you. Tell me where you are in the world. Tell me what you hear from your window right now. Tell me anything. I will read it. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the last time I will ask tonight. I promise. Please subscribe. Like the video. Share it with someone who needs a voice in the dark. This community is built one quiet act of sharing at a time, and every single one of you who does that is part of how the stories keep being told. Thank you for From the very bottom of wherever gratitude lives, thank you. Good night, my sleepy friends. You are safe. You are warm. You are held in this strange and wonderful community of people who listen in the dark. The rain is there. The dark is soft. The night is complete. Sleep well. Sleep gently. Sleep as long as you need to. I will see you next time. Good night.